It is 7:01 p.m. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting. I am Bill Colebrook, Ward 6. Is the clerk ready?
Yes.
Okay, I will then call the meeting to order. And let me make an announcement first. Due to the Governor Pritzker and mayoral emergency COVID-19 orders, the Urbana City Council chambers will not be open to the public during this meeting. Council members will meet remotely using Zoom webinar. You may watch the meeting on streaming services or on Urbana Public Television or attend via Zoom. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Ms. Wu?
Here.
Ms. Lout?
Here.
Ms. Hersey?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Colebrook?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Mayor Marlin?
Here.
First on the agenda, we've got the approval of the minutes from August 17th, 2020. Is there a motion?
I'll move approval.
I'll second.
Mary Alice moved, Julie seconded. Any discussion or corrections on the minutes?
No.
Okay, haven't seen none. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Sure. Ms. Wu?
Yes.
Ms. Lout?
Yes.
Ms. Hersey?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Colebrook?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Okay, with that, the minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is additions to the agenda. Mayor?
Mr. Chair, I have two. One is I would like to read a proclamation for the Urbana Free Library, and I would request that we do that before the presentation by our guest tonight. And then the second addition is to add a discussion item for discussion of the Hillard Hines reports, and I would recommend putting that under number 7 on the agenda. So that will become number 8. And then the GARE discussion will be number 9, followed by the public input. Do we need, Ms. Clerk, do we need a vote on that?
Just to change the agenda around like that? No, I don't think you do for that.
Okay, thank you.
So Mayor, you're up with the library proclamation.
Yes, and with us tonight is the director of the Urbana Free Library, Celeste Schote. Normally we would read this in council chambers and I would be able to hand this proclamation, but we're doing it virtually. So this is a proclamation by the mayor of the city of Urbana, Illinois. Whereas a library card is the most essential school supply of all, and whereas libraries play a crucial role in the education and development of children. And whereas libraries offer a variety of programs to stimulate an interest in reading and learning. And whereas library resources serve students of all ages, from early literacy to STEAM programs to research databases. And whereas signing up for a library card is the first step on the path toward academic achievement and lifelong learning. And whereas a library card gives students the tools that foster success in the classroom and beyond. And whereas library staff bring communities together, creating welcoming and inclusive spaces for students of all backgrounds to learn together. And whereas libraries are constantly transforming and expanding their services to meet the evolving needs of their communities. Now, therefore, I, Diane Wolf Marlin, Mayor of the City of Urbana, do hereby proclaim the month of September 2020 as Library Card Sign-Up Month in the City of Urbana, Illinois, And I encourage everyone to sign up for their own library card today.
Yay.
Hey.
Bill, can I say something?
Yes, you may, Mary Alice.
Celeste, I know that there's a way to get a virtual card nowadays. If it's okay, would you mind telling the public how they might be able to do that?
Yes, you can go to our website, urbanafreelibrary.org, and you can sign up for an e-card so that you can use our online resources for a period of time. And then you can come into the library and get it so that you can use things you can physically check out in the real world as well. If you're not comfortable coming into the library, we'll do a curbside pickup for you, and you can apply for a card at your car, and we'll get your library card out there. We want to make it as easy as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your support of the library and our community.
We like the library.
Congratulations, Celeste.
Thanks for all your good work, Celeste.
Bill, can I say something before she leaves?
Sharice, yes.
I just want to say I have always enjoyed the library since I was a little girl. I remember my mother taking my brother and I to the library to get our first library cards. And knowing, you know, it was always great. If I could not find a book at my school library, I could go to the library or Urbana Free Library, and usually the book that I was looking for would be there in the children's section, but it would be there. So I think that I grew up thinking of the library as somewhat of a safe haven in a place where I could actually go and check out books and learn more about the world, learn more about different people, learn more, reading books, fantasy books or whatever, and my hope is that more people will be able to take advantage of the library. We have a great library, and I've been to a few around the country, and I think that our library really rocks. So I just want to say that. You do such a great job, Celeste. Thank you.
Therese, thank you so much. Instilling the love of learning and lifelong literacy and enjoying it is what we are there to do. My staff are so devoted and so engaged with the community. Also, you paid your taxes. You've already paid for library service. So come on in and see what you paid for.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody else from the council? Having seen none, we will thank you, Celeste, and we will move on. Mayor, did you have something else here in the additions to the agenda before we move on?
No, just that discussion item to move down.
So I just want to be clear. We are going to, just so the public understands the order. So we've got, of course, number 6, the ordinance, ratification of extension of emergency order. We've got number 7, an ordinance, ratification of emergency order. And then 8 was going to be the discussion on Hillard Heights. 9 was going to be the discussion of City of Urbana membership in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And then 10 was going to be public input. And I want to be clear before we move on, do we need to have a motion in a second and then have the clerk call the roll before we move public input down to number 10?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I'll just start off and believe, I think maybe in the best interest of tonight's agenda, given the fact that we've got a pretty big presentation from Hillard Heights, and then the 2 ordinances, and then of course the discussion on Hillard Heights and discussion on Gare. I think in order for us to get through the business move that public input to number 10. Would anybody like to discuss, or is there a motion to move it to number 10? Jared.
I mean, I guess we're having a discussion about it. I mean, I know we've all probably been used to this. I certainly anticipate that we're going to need to continue this meeting into tomorrow. And folks are here to give input. This is when they're expecting to. So just as my thoughts to other council members, I would respectfully ask to keep it in the place where it is. We have 53 participants. That's not an outrageously large number compared to what we normally have. So just my thoughts. Thanks.
Dennis.
I think it's more useful to the entire community to have the presentation of the Hillard Hines materials first before we have discussion with the public or with ourselves. So I'm not averse to moving it down. So I guess I can make the motion for doing that. I'll make a motion that we move the agenda item, whether it needs to be before or after the GARE presentation, I don't know, but certainly after the Hillard Hines presentation.
So just so we're clear, Dennis, are you suggesting that what is the motion specifically? Is it to move the public input to the bottom or to move the public input after the presentation and discussion?
After the presentation and discussion.
Okay, I'll second that motion. I think it would be helpful for the public to hear the presentation before providing comment on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to be clear. So we've got 2 discussion items. Number 8 is discussion on Hillard Hines, and number 9 is discussion on the GARE initiative. And my thought was have that presentation as well to give the public an opportunity to comment on both if they wish. So it would land at number 10 after the GARE. Is that not what the motion is?
Well, right now it's not, but you know, if the meeting ends up being continued to another day, we're not going to hear public input, which is, I think, real important tonight. So I don't know how long and how depth of a presentation of the GARE topic is. Maybe Julie and Jared can comment on it.
It's much more an informal discussion, Dennis. I don't suspect that we're necessarily we'll have opportunities to get input on it. I don't think we're seeking public input in that presentation. And just for clarity, it sounded from your motion, Dennis, like you would put it after 4 and before the staff report of 5, like directly after the presentation is what it sounded like to me. Is that what you were intending?
Well, it would be nice to get the 2 ordinances about the emergency orders out of the docket before we, just to clear up what I would consider important business first, maybe, and then go into that public business. So it would be move it down to following 7.
So you're talking about after the ordinances.
Yeah. Do we want to get, I mean, does council want to get those ordinances ratified before we get into what I think is going to be a lengthy public input area?
I think it's important to try to get as much city business done as possible, and tonight's going to be one of those nights that otherwise we would, you know, it'll be 11 o'clock night for some of you, not for me, because I'm gonna be through at 10:30. I have medications to pass. I can't keep doing that late.
Julie?
Yeah, I would just like to be clear. I will, if the council wants our discussion about or public input to come after our council discussion of Hillard Hines, that's fine with me. That means you're pushing the agenda item that I wanted to put on tonight to another time. But I don't want also it to be dismissed as something that isn't important. I feel like in some ways the discussion of it and our perspectives on implementing something like the GARE model is actually integral to questions about policing as well. So I just want to be sure I'm not being dismissed as some like minor, I don't think anyone was doing that, but it sounded a little bit like there was a flippancy about it, and I wanted to be sure. Again, I'm happy to move it. I know that the Hillard Hines has been coming down the road for a lot longer than my item was, but I do think it's going to be a very important discussion to have.
But I actually agree with you, Julie. I think it's important to get the GARE conversation out there as well,
Yeah.
sooner rather than later.
All right, so I'll amend my motion, and I'll follow the direction that you were heading originally, Bill, to we'll have public input after the GARE presentation.
Okay, so number 8 would be discussion on Hillard Heinz. Number 9 would be discussion on GARE. And number 10 would be public input. Give the public an opportunity to comment on anything above that we did tonight.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Does anybody go
So
along with that?
there's a motion. Is there a second? Not yet. Jared, you had your hand raised.
I just was going to comment, there is absolutely no way we are getting public comment tonight. There is no way we're going to get public input tonight if we put this as the last item on this agenda. No way. So I think it's highly inappropriate. People are coming here expecting to give input tonight, and for them to say, sorry, you're going to have to wait until 10:45, and then if we run out of time, well, we ran out of time. That's the end of the meeting. I think this is highly inappropriate. No way.
Bill, you had your hand raised.
I wondered if we had any indication of how long the Hilliard Hines presentation will be. I know with questions, it's hard to tell, and if there's any staff report.
I don't believe there's going to be a staff report.
There is no staff report.
Do you know how long the presentation would be if there were no questions?
I don't, but we have 3 people from Hillard Hines here. Perhaps one could comment on that. Mark or Deborah?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. We anticipate that our presentation will run approximately 45 minutes, and that is without comment. It may be quicker depending upon the number of slides, but we want to be able to make sure that we give you full vest, so between 30 and 45 minutes.
Right, thanks. I think if we limited our questions and discussion, it's possible to get started on public input by 9 o'clock. So I guess I would support it if we haven't started public input by 9 o'clock, we have to enter discussion and do public input.
Mary Alice, you had your hand raised as well.
I did. I'm trying to balance what Jared is saying and Julie is saying. Julie, I completely agree with you. The conversation about GARE is very important. I think it needs due course. We need to be able to discuss it at length without being worried about the time limit. And Jared, I also hear you that there are many people who have been waiting for this report and many people who are here today who probably want to comment on it. So keeping those in mind, and Julie, I just want to emphasize that I do think it's very important. What will your thoughts be on moving your agenda item to the next city council meeting as a discussion item? And that might even give it more time for us to have a conversation. And sure. People would, okay, so I'm just going to propose that we do that. Hopefully, Jared, maybe that would allow for public input to be here tonight.
That's fine. I just want to emphasize that
yeah.
To me, these questions are all going to be of a whole as we're moving forward. And yeah, so, but I understand that public input is good. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'm not trying to diminish it at all. I just trying to figure out juggling the schedules here.
No, I appreciate that. We can withdraw it from this agenda and focus just on the Hillard Hines and getting those 2 other emergency things finished for tonight. That might seem like the most logical thing to do.
I still think the only thing that I would say, and I'm not opposed to that, it's Julie brought it forward, so she's okay with sending it to the next one item too. But I would say that public input at the very least has to come before council discussion. So the discussion item that we're reserving for our discussion about it, I think public input at the very least has got to come before that, because we could spend quite some time ourselves talking about it. And I'm just worried about being able to get people in.
I understand that, Jared, but what's one thing, and this, I know I'm a newbie, so I've got new eyes coming into this, but what my experience has been is that our opportunities due to the OMA's limitations on us mean that we get almost no time to ever talk as a council together. And so, you know, I don't know, I'm not weighing one over the other, but it is really, I have to admit how much I want to hear what people are saying, and I try to respond to them. I'm emailing people, I'm trying to get in touch and talk to them, but it also is extremely frustrating for me that the council itself is so rarely getting a chance to engage with one another and hear one another's ideas, except one-on-one.
Well, Julie, my only response would be that I have often encouraged that we do more than just our Monday meetings, that we hold special meetings, that we engage in this process in a lot more substantive manner than just trying to get it done on Monday nights. And, you know, I would just, you know, it is our duty to the people who we represent to be able to have their voices heard when they're supposed to be heard. It's been our procedure for forever to, you know, have public input before we really handle our business. This is the first time I think I've ever, in my time on council, heard somebody suggest that we move it to the last item of the agenda, which I find highly unusual and highly inappropriate given the circumstances and the substance of what we're expecting to hear from folks. I think their input is nearly as valuable, if not more valuable, than what we're gonna hear elsewhere, or what we'll be able to contribute to one another. We have a lot of really well-informed community members who have a lot of really important and useful things that I think we all need to hear, to consider in our discussion, not after our discussion. So just my thoughts.
Any other discussion? Dennis, to be clear, what was your motion?
Well, it would be it originally was to put it just before the GARE presentation. If the GARE presentation has been, if we're going to move it to a time slot on our next meeting so that we can look at that and respond to it freshly, I think that's appropriate, because we just can't go through all these reports and all the public input. And I think that by 10:30, we're not really as well focused as we are right now. So yes, I would still make a motion that public input come later, that we first have the Hilliard-Hines presentations, that we have a conversation among ourselves, because I think I agree with Julie that we almost never get a chance to have a conversation with each other, and that you know, that time ends up being at the very end of any meetings and is curtailed often. And then take care of the two ordinances, which I think will only take about 5 minutes to do that, and then open it up for public. We can allow the public to speak for the rest of the meeting.
So your motion is that public input still come after number 8, discussion on Hilliard-Hines, and before adjournment, but we are taking the GARE discussion out.
Yes, that's right.
Is there a second?
A second.
Sharice seconds this. Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Yeah, just a second. Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Ms. Lout,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
No.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes, I think so.
Mr. Colebrook,
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
No.
With that, I believe the motion passes. Next up would be a presentation from Hilliard-Hines.
Yes.
Oh, Mayor?
I'd like to introduce it, please.
Yes.
Okay, so just as a way of introduction, this summer, the city of Urbana hired Hilliard-Hines to review the internal investigation of the Urbana Police Department's use of force in the arrest of Aaliyah Lewis on April 10th, 2020. The city also asked Hillard Hines to compare the Urbana Police Department's use of force policy to national standards and best practices, to investigate an allegation of misconduct that was related to a video that was posted on social media, and then to facilitate community engagement via 3 Zoom meetings. They're going to be presenting the findings tonight, and I expect we'll move forward and make a number of changes based on the substantive recommendations that they made regarding our use of force and our policy and practices. I also feel that this is going to be very useful in conjunction with our upcoming workshop on implementing the 10 shared principles with the NAACP. I want to also remind the public that due to the pending criminal cases and possible litigation related to this matter, that City Council and staff are still limited in some of the types of things they can discuss related to this case, but our city attorney will keep us on track in that regard. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Deborah Kirby, who's the Senior Vice President of Operations, Mark Jufrey, who's a Director, and Marcia Thompson, Vice President, Law Enforcement Consulting, and they will be presenting on both of the reports that they've brought forward tonight.
Right. Good afternoon or good evening, Mayor and Council, and members of the public. We will be presenting a PowerPoint regarding our report delivery, which will start shortly. And we will then proceed through what we did, how we did it, and why we did it. I'm waiting for the video to start. And once we get that up and running, we'll be able to. So we're here tonight to talk about our independent review of the Urbana Department's use of force practices. From a matter of agenda, we will be covering what Hillard, next slide, Marcia, sorry. Next, thank you. For a matter of agenda, we'll cover briefly who Hillard Hines is, an introduction of our team and what we were asked to do. We will review the outcomes of the use of force actions. We will provide you with key findings from our policy review. We will also discuss the outcomes of the community perspectives. As the mayor identified, we were also asked to review an issue around the video that was posted relative to this incident, and then we will provide a summary of our work for the council. Hillard Hines is a nationally and internationally recognized security risk management firm. For the purposes of our presence here today, I oversee the law enforcement consulting and investigations arm of Hillard Hines. Our law enforcement consulting services provides a range of services to clients across the United States. We are the sole independent contractor for the U.S. Department of Justice on collaborative reform, which was targeting key reform issues across America, particularly related to use of force. And we continue to provide advisory services to our clients, primarily municipalities and public safety agencies. And we also continue to provide support to the U.S. Department of Justice relative to use of force training issues and other issues as identified. The team that worked this project is on the screen before you. As the mayor identified, I was Deborah Kirby, and I provided management oversight on the project. We have a range of participants with me tonight as Marcia Thompson and Mark Jufrey, and I will let both of them speak for themselves. And then we also use 2 investigators, Mr. Jones and Ms. Colvin, to provide investigation support services relative to this review. Marcia, would you like to introduce yourself, and then Mark can introduce, and then we can move on to the presentation.
Thanks, Deb. My name is Marcia Thompson. I'm a civil rights attorney. I've been doing police reform since about 2001, and been with Hillard Hines for about 1.5 years. And was with them previously during the Obama administration for 2 years as well. And I'm currently the Vice President for Law Enforcement Consulting. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Deb. My name is Mark Jufrey. I was with DEA for 30 years, and 5 of those years I served as a chief inspector overseeing investigations of allegations of misconduct by law enforcement officers across the United States. Currently, I lead our public integrity investigations team under Deborah's direction here at Hilliard Heights.
Okay, Mark, you want to start with the presentation? Thanks.
Sure. So I want to start with what were we asked to do? We were asked to conduct an independent review of the sufficiency of the police department's examination of this use of force incident. We were asked to review the related policies and procedures, to engage community stakeholders regarding perception and expectation of the department's use of force practices, and also to review a reported issue regarding UPD's actions regarding a video from social media. So what did we do? We reviewed documents including police reports, photographs, body-worn camera footage, squad car camera footage, 911 call dispatch and radio traffic, publicly sourced videos of the incident. We evaluated the training records, the department's use of force policies, and the use of force investigation reports. We conducted interviews of the department's use of force internal experts. We conducted focus group sessions with community stakeholders, and we interviewed the civilian who had posted the video footage related to the claim that officers had asked him to remove video from social media. I want to start with a very brief summary of the incident. On April 10th at approximately 4:36 p.m., officers responded to a dispatch of a possible shooting on Colorado and Cottage Grove in Urbana. Cameron Busby and Alea Lewis were at the location and matched the descriptions that were given to the officers. Mr. Busby was taken into custody and a gun was recovered from him. Sergeant Michael Cervantes gave verbal commands to Miss Lewis. She did not comply. When Sergeant Cervantes tried to handcuff Miss Lewis, she struck him in the face and resisted. Sergeant Cervantes took Miss Lewis to the ground. Miss Lewis continued to resist and pull her arms away. Officer Eric Ruff gave a verbal command and struck Miss Lewis with his hand. She continued to resist. Officers continued to give verbal commands and Miss Lewis continued resisting. Officer Ruff struck Miss Lewis with his knee. Miss Lewis was handcuffed in the stomach down position and kicked her legs and rocked her body. Officer Ruff sat on her ankles. Miss Lewis reached for Officer Ruff's weapon duty belt. Officer Ruff lifted her handcuffed hands up away from his belt area. In the squad car, Miss Lewis spit at and kicked officers. She was placed in a spit hood and hobble to prevent spitting and kicking. So I wanted to go into our key findings relative to the use of force. We found that Sergeant Cervantes' use of force, that his use of force actions were in policy. And we looked specifically at him taking Miss Lewis to the ground using his hip, leg, and arm, and his pushing his knee and elbow into her back shoulder area. The department's policy requires officers use only the amount of force that reasonably appears necessary to effect an arrest and defend him or herself or another. Sergeant Cervantes attempted to gain Miss Lewis's compliance with verbal commands to no avail. Lewis struck Cervantes' face. Cervantes took Miss Lewis to the ground and tried to handcuff her. She pulled her hand away and under her body. Sergeant Cervantes believed Lewis could have a gun. Sergeant Cervantes used his knee and elbow against her back as leverage to try to pull her hand back to be handcuffed. Key findings relative to Officer Ruff's use of force: the issue related to Officer Ruff striking Lewis with his hand and with his knee. We found that the actions were in policy. The department's policy requires officers use only the amount of force that reasonably appears necessary to effect an arrest and defend him or herself. Officer Ruff observed Miss Lewis strike Sergeant Cervantes. Officer Ruff tried to handcuff Miss Lewis. She pulled her arms away under her body. Officer Ruff believed Lewis could have a gun. Officer Ruff gave a verbal command and struck Miss Lewis once with his hand. Miss Lewis continued to resist. Officer Ruff gave more verbal commands. Miss Lewis continued resisting. Officer Ruff struck Lewis once with his knee. Continuing review of Officer Ruff's use of force. This issue was Officer Ruff sitting on Miss Lewis' ankles and raising her handcuffed hands into the air. We found that the actions were within department policy. The department policy requires the officers use only the amount of force reasonably necessary to effect an arrest and defend himself. After being handcuffed, Miss Lewis kicked her legs and rocked her body back and forth. Officer Ruff sat on her ankles to prevent her from kicking. Ms. Lewis reached her handcuffed hands towards Officer Ruff's gun belt and rifle. Officer Ruff lifted the handcuffs to raise her arms up and away from his gun belt and rifle. In addition, finding relative to Officer Ruff's use of force, the issue was Officer Ruff placing a spit hood over Ms. Lewis's head and wrapping a hobble around her legs. We found that the actions were in policy. In the squad car, Ms. Lewis spit at an officer. Officer Ruff placed a spit hood over Ms. Lewis's head to prevent her from spitting at officers. Ms. Lewis kicked the side of the squad car 3 or 4 times. She kicked 2 officers. Officer Ruff placed a hobble on Ms. Lewis to prevent her from kicking. So in our review of the sufficiency of the police department's actions in reviewing the incident, we found that the department's use of force review board's determination was supported by a preponderance of the evidence, and the use of force in this case was consistent with the department's use of force policies. Our review was limited to the use of force process. However, we had other issues that became concerns. The first was verbal engagement. We believe that warrants review. The second is use of rifle while engaging a suspect. We believe that warrants review. The third is use of verbal commands. We believe that warrants review. And finally, the use of force investigation procedures warrant review. And I'm going to turn this over to Deborah to review these concerns as well as a policy review.
So as Mark identified, we were looking at the use of force review process, but in context with, we're also looking at the use of force policies adopted by the Urbana PD. What we did identify is that within their policies, they address key concepts of the sanctity of life and duty to intervene. And these are good practices consistent with progressive police agencies. Also, much of the data that is available in this incident is a result of the use of body-worn cameras. So that too is a good practice. However, as we're seeing, particularly based on recent events nationally, is that the way that policing is looking at specific use of force and how it applies within the overall community standard in which it occurs is on a shifting scale right now. And our review of the policies identified areas where we believe that the Urbana PD should examine and consider improvements as they go forward. Marcia, the next slide, please. So when we look at de-escalation, this is a term that has grown in knowledge and acceptance across the country as it relates to police engagement on use of force. While the website for the Urbana PD references it, it is not contained within the overall policies. And the reason that we focus on policy is that policy guides the actions of officers and that the training should occur in support of the policy so that officers are consistently trained in alignment with the goals and policy vision of the organization. So as far as our recommendation is concerned is that it's important to imbue this concept within its use of force policies and to ensure that de-escalation is trained in accordance with the use of force training. The more the agency is able to integrate de-escalation into its use of force decision tree, the less likely we are to use force in incidents where it cannot or where it is not necessary in terms of the situation faced. Next slide, please. What Mark identified is that a significant actions taken by the Urbana officers occurred while Ms. Lewis was in restraints. And so the understanding here is that because somebody is restrained does not mean that they're not able to cause harm to themselves or to officers. However, the standards for force for somebody who's already restrained need to be specific and relate specifically to the issues faced relative to the safety of the individual or of the officers. The Urbana use of force policy does not specifically address acceptable force standards for restrained subjects, but rather overall uses a factor decision in terms of what is reasonableness without distinction as to whether or not an individual is restrained. Nationally, we're seeing agencies adopt standards, particularly those driven by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, that identify that specificity is needed when using force on restrained individuals. In particular, because this allows for force necessary to meet the resistance and also ensures that officers are trained and held to standard in engaging restrained individuals. So our recommendation is that the policy includes this language within the Urbana policies. Next slide. The other issue that we're seeing and has been an issue within law enforcement for some time, and frankly within Illinois, there was significant training conducted in the early 90s, is the concept of positional asphyxia. We have seen this issue come to tragic consequence in other events nationally. Unfortunately, we did not see such an outcome in Urbana. But when officers use body weight to restrict the movements of an individual, there is the potential for tragic consequences. That did not happen in this event. And we note that the Urbana policy does not specifically define what are the tragic potential outcomes for positional asphyxiation, and they don't identify the factors for specific review of positional asphyxiation. The department does have a delirium review factor sheet, but that is not specifically incorporated within the use of force. And it needs to be recognized that as officers take movement to control individuals, they need to be aware and be able to adjust for the risks associated with persons who are exhibiting excited delirium, as well as the concept or as the potential outcome for positional asphyxiation. Next slide, please. So one of the things that struck us as a team as we watched the videos of the event is that you had an officer who was controlling a rifle while engaging in hands-on contact with a subject. This is a risky situation absent exigent need. As Mark identified, while the officer was engaged with the subject, there was reach up to the belt and the officer had to reposition his rifle. What we recommend is that the department review its policies and how it trains officers who carry rifles. And we specifically recommend that they should consider stating that absent exigent circumstances, officers who are carrying rifles will not go hands-on with an individual who is in need of restraint or hand-to-hand engagement. In this circumstance, as we've noticed, the officer was there for some period of time. That rifle or the officer should have been relieved, and that is our recommendation. Next slide. We also note that during this event, and not specific to the use of force incident, there were multiple directions, verbal direction given to subjects by officers who were on the scene. When dealing with a high-risk stop, particularly one in which a subject is expected to be armed, that could have, again, the potential for tragic outcome. Our recommendation to the department, in that the policy is silent to this factor, is that they should train to a control officer and then ensure that one officer is giving directions to a subject or an individual to ensure consistent and complete direction to that individual, and to ensure that multiple or competing direction is not given. We have seen tragic outcome as a result of conflicting directions given, and it is a good practice to ensure that there is always a control officer who is responsible for providing direction to an individual, particularly one that's anticipated or suspected of being armed, to be able to engage appropriately in terms of the directions given. Next slide. While not within the range of a use of force review, what our review did identify is that there was some engaged conversation with the subject that was not consistent nor appropriate to the incident at hand. We did not identify a policy specific to this action, but we note that when engaging with individuals, particularly those that are deemed to be in an altered state, either through drugs or some sort of mental impairment or incapacity, is that officers should be directed to provide limited engagement, clear direction, and not deal with inappropriate or unnecessary language while engaging those individuals. Some of the language may have been seen as patronizing. And again, while outside our scope, we believe that language as one engages with subjects is important. And to be able to train officers to limit any escalation of a scene by engaging in language that directs an individual, but that does not antagonize an individual or is unnecessary in terms of the directions given at the time. Next slide. When we look at the use of force investigations procedures, what we identify is that supervisors receive generalized training at the time of their promotion, and they are not subsequently provided annual refresher training in how to conduct use of force investigations. We know, as does the public and the council, is that these are very serious incidents and they resonate within the community, and the ability to provide a full and accurate investigation is important. And so we believe that supervisors who are tasked with investigations into use of force should receive training specific to such investigations, and it should be provided annually. Some agencies use specific supervisors based upon their internal knowledge and experience as use of force investigators, and it may vary depending upon the seriousness of the force incident. Here in Urbana, you have a board that reviews all of the investigation, but at the same time, that initial point of contact, that supervisor who's directing the investigation, should receive training that is consistent and annually updated, because as we're seeing, we are in a time of change relative to expectations for law enforcement and what are the standards that we want law enforcement to engage in. And supervisors who are trained in these incidents are better at the investigations. Next slide. So when we talk about the use of force investigations procedures, what we found was that the Urbana policy is permissive, is that supervisors who are charged with investigating may interview officers, may interview witnesses. And so what we know is that absent a formal requirement to interview an officer, it may or may not happen. We believe, and as does national practice identify, that it is the best standard to allow officers to tell in their own words the experience or their vision of what happened relative to the use of force incident. In this matter, the reports are what inform the board for the UPD, and while the reports were sufficient in terms of what they were able to report, as well as being supported by the body-worn camera, the perspective of the officer is important in terms of what happened and allowing the board to make a full determination. Next slide. I'm sorry, can you go back one more, Marcia? All right, so I am missing a slide here, and so I will talk about it because it is related here as well, is that in this circumstance, and along with the policies of the UPD, the interview of civilians that were the subject of force is not mandated either. In this case, the UPD did make 2 efforts to reach out to the subject. However, they were unsuccessful in that contact. We believe that, as with officers, the policy should mandate interviews with civilians who are affected or who have been subjected to use of force, consistent with the factual belief that parties involved in the incident should be able to give a firsthand response as to what happened. This would help better inform the board. In this matter, she was not available, and the department was not required to further reach out or to engage the individual who was subject to the use of force. All right, and on this one, Marcia, I pass to you.
Thanks, Deb. So part of the outreach that we did in this particular review was we held what we call learning sessions. The city had provided 9 themes that had been, I guess, highlighted from some previous engagement that was done prior to our being involved in this particular incident. And we took those 9 themes and developed them into a set of PowerPoints, as well as some questions specifically geared at those particular themes that came out of the prior engagement. We sent out invitations to a list of about 50 people throughout the city. The list was pretty diverse, covering different organizations, faith-based organizations, universities, community groups, advocacy groups, legal organizations as well. And out of those 50 invitations, about 20 responded affirmatively and 18 ended up attending 3 of the learning sessions. 2 were held during the day and 1 was held during the evening to discuss those themes. Those 9 themes, just in case everybody's not aware of those, 1 was calls for service and dispatch procedures. The second one was de-escalation procedures. The third was use of rifles. The fourth was use of patronizing, racist, or sexist language. The fifth was excessive use of force. The 6th was possible armed subject procedures, how those are handled. The 7th was administrative leave procedures as it related to police officers engaged in any type of use of force. The 8th was release of body camera or squad car camera footage. And there was a concern by the community that sometimes it was insufficient. And then the 9th concern was actually release of body cameras and squad car camera footage, and that it might be too much. And that was in the converse when it came to the potential suspect. So those were the 9 areas that were shared with us from the city to develop what we call learning sessions, which are not listening sessions in that sense that it's not just dialogue on the incident specifically, but on issues that came out that the city received from community members. And so we built a conversation around those, created a questionnaire that went into those 9 areas, and other areas of concern that came out about administrative leave, de-escalation, some of the other things that my colleagues have touched on already in our presentation that were part of this review. Out of those, we developed some recommendations that came out of the 3 sessions. These sessions themselves, again, with 18 people, smaller than we would have liked, but the conversations that were had, I felt were very robust and actually resulted in some very good recommendations, which you will find in our report. I'm going to highlight some of those recommendations for you now, though. Some of the recommendations were explore more opportunities for co-education and outreach within the community, create a community engagement plan that has measurable outcomes and goals, and these are obviously directed towards the police department and the city. Assess the current oversight mechanisms within the city and explore an enhanced oversight model for police accountability. There was a lot of discussion about the current oversight that is in Urbana and whether or not it had enough, I guess one person mentioned the word bite in it, and had enough authority to hold police accountable. So there was a lot of discussion around that. Creating additional educational opportunities for the community to better understand the actual complaint process, how they can get involved more actively, also how they can follow up on complaints, and then mechanisms for filing complaints. So those were some of the initial recommendations. Some additional recommendations were explore opportunities to have data reviewed on racial and ethnic disparities and use that data throughout the city to embrace change. They talked about also establishing opportunities for organizations to work with youth, create more positive contacts between the department and the community. We know from research that positive interactions at an earlier age create positive interactions later on within the communities and build trust within the communities. Another recommendation was work more collaboratively with the community, develop practices and policies, and looking at national best practices. And it wasn't just looking at national best practices, but the most important piece I think that came out of that was involving the community in that. So they felt like they had more of a voice in policies and procedures that came out of the police department. There was a lot of discussion about transparency of what was going on with the department, how they could get involved in transparency, how the department could enhance their transparency as to what was going on as well. And I know that there was also comment about what was on the department's website and whether things were redacted or open to the public. So that was some other discussions that came out of the transparency. Providing training and also what kinds of training the police department had. And there was a lot of questions about cultural competency, empathy, procedural justice, leadership, what types of ethical training they had, and then also accountability and reporting of officer misconduct. So if there was a requirement for the department to report somewhere else if an officer was involved in misconduct, but also monitoring officers' stability. So if officers had stressors outside of the workplace that may have manifest themselves in the workplace or out on the street, and then how they were handling that stress, and then what types of mechanisms were internal to the department to, one, identify those stressors, two, how to better handle those stressors, and then if there was ongoing mental health awareness and screening of officers throughout their careers, and then particularly after those officers were involved in force incidents, you know, what happened in those cases where they required to do some type of mental health assessment before they were allowed to be back on the job. There was also recommendations to create better partnerships within the community with the other affinity organizations to continue to build trust within the broader community, with the faith-based community, and then also particularly in the African-American community. So those were some of the highlights that came out of the 3 sessions. There was a lot of other things that people brought up independently and individually, but these are some of the major themes that came out of the sessions. And one of the things that I want to note was during the PowerPoint presentation, we covered those 9 themes, and we covered definitions around a lot of the different procedures. And again, my colleagues covered many of those in their review of the use of force practices for the department, such as the rifles and the de-escalation. But some of the other topics that were raised in those 9 themes, like calls for service and dispatch, we had discussions around that. And we also talked about, use of force, what it meant. We also talked about, in the questionnaire, people were asked whether or not they had ever seen use of force, if they ever experienced watching someone else have force used on them, and whether they thought the force was within appropriate means based on what they were observing. So there was lots of questions around that. There was also questions about the officers' flexibility, the department's flexibility, and what could happen to an officer after they were involved in force. So we talked a little bit about the officer's Bill of Rights and other things that were put into law in the state of Illinois, as well as nationally, as far as best practices, as well as the Officer's Bill of Rights, which is not just here in Illinois, but other states. And so a lot of discussion around what that meant and how those may constrain a department for what, in fact, an officer has the right after being involved in use of force. We also talked about union protections, and then we talked about body camera across the nation, what body camera procedures were, and whether or not when they could be released, and that there was really no clear law on body cameras, when and how often or how soon something should be released, and that there was a large gap in between different departments as to when body camera information was released. So those were things that came up in some of those discussions. And during the learning session itself, that was covered in the PowerPoint to give the community a better understanding of some of those topics, particularly on a global scene, but then also specifically to Illinois. And information was exchanged where they could find additional information, particularly to Illinois standards. And we closed the learning session on the NAACP's shared principles that they had signed with Illinois Chiefs of Police Association in 2018. And that was something that covered many of the same topics that we discussed in our learning sessions. And it was brought to my attention during one of our learning sessions that the department was actually about to engage in training with the NAACP. That was something that was brought up during the sessions and discussed as well. And then also brought up as one of the issues was, how was that training going to be conducted? What were going to be the measures that came out of it? But people were happy that the department was embracing those. And I believe that they also put that on their webpage. So those are some of the things that we covered during the 3 sessions. And from there, I will pass it back to my colleague.
Thanks, Marcia. And finally, we started out with the asks and what we did, and you recall we were asked to review this do an independent investigation regarding the video claim. So in May of 2020, an online article reported that department officers had allegedly visited a civilian's home and asked him to take down his video of the April 10th incident from social media. So we conducted an interview of that civilian, and he stated that he was not contacted by department officers and he was not asked by anyone to take down the video. So our recommendation to the city was that we didn't believe that his statements substantiated a claim of misconduct against the officers, but if new information was developed, it should be looked into.
So in closing, what we'd like to address is that what the city of Urbana is experiencing is a national issue. Too often we are seeing use of force incidents against persons of color that in secondary review warrant some concern by the community, as well as by the city, as well as by the department. The Urbana PD has a basic good policy. They are using body-worn camera. They have committed in their public comments on their website and in partnership with the NAACP in Urbana to improving practices around use of force. Our recommendations are really meant to provide, 18 in all, are meant to provide a roadmap for the city and the department and its communities to review and consider how they want to move forward in Urbana around issues that frankly are challenging across the United States. We've identified what we felt were some of the key policy discussion issues. Marcia identified what were some of the outtakes from the community engagement that we had provided at the direction of the city. And where we stand today is that we believe our report provides a good foundation for the city to assess. And as we heard earlier before this meeting started, is that there are ongoing initiatives within the city meant to help engage the community in a more holistic manner, as well as engage with the police department relative to its use of force practices. What we do know is that when an agency or a municipality asks for an outside review, it is the first step in an act of transparency because they have committed to bringing forward a light into a process that sometimes doesn't have a lot of visibility. And so this is the first step. It's our recommendation that the city consider the recommendations made and identify the best path forward for the residents in Urbana in terms of achieving the goals and the outcomes that you seek as a community. On that point, we thank you for your time and are open to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Kirby and team. We appreciate your work and the presentation tonight. Does anybody from the council have any questions of the Hilliard Heights team? Jared.
Well, thank you all for your report this evening. I've got a number of questions that I wanted to ask about things that were mentioned in the report or that I didn't see mentioned in the report that have been brought to my attention or were things that I noticed myself. First of which I wanted to ask about, you guys had mentioned something, or at least numerous times there was mention of the use of Officer Ruff's rifle as he was effecting the physical arrest of Ms. Lewis. And there was evidence that was submitted to me that was posted, and I would be happy to share with you all, but I was curious as to, finding out a little bit more about, you simply gave us the, we should review that we don't have a policy about it, but I'm interested in your expert opinions as to whether effecting the arrest while carrying the rifle is an appropriate thing just generally from the experience you all have with police departments. I imagine it's not. And second, if you guys were noticed that throughout, at least with the evidence that's been presented to me, Officer Ruff's weapon remained in the fire position throughout the arrest until after the arrest was basically completed and he had left the presence of Ms. Lewis when she was handcuffed. And, that's doubly concerning. I mean, it's concerning enough that a rifle is there. So I'm just interested in your professional opinions as to the presence of the rifle, and why did you notice that the fire position remained in the rifle during the arrest? And if you did, why was it not mentioned in the report?
Sorry. I can speak to the policy and practice around rifles and how they're used when engaging with the suspect. Surprisingly, it is not a standard across law enforcement in terms of what I identify as a control officer with the rifle. I am aware of some policies and some training in terms of how to engage a subject while armed with a rifle. And for example, the Chicago Police Department prohibits, directs that the armed officer will not engage with the subject absent exigent circumstances. And so from a realistic point of view, particularly when you're dealing with sole responders, one-person cars, it is hard to be prescriptive, but it is a best practice to limit the engagement while one is trying to secure, if you think about it, securing a weapon in any environment is challenging. And when you're securing both a sidearm as well as a rifle, that increases the challenge and the risk. And so that's why we made the recommendation. I am not aware that the fire position was on, and I'm not sure that that came up as part of the review. But based on your concern and your note, we will go back and assess whether or not that was a violation of policy, and if it was noted by the board.
And I would, if I could just add to that, Ms. Curry makes reference of exigent circumstances, and in the real world, situations are not ideal. You'll note in our report that, and particularly in the summary of the details of the events, that Officer Ruff responded to assist when there were no other officers present to respond to assist. Other officers were engaged with the custody of the other civilian who had a loaded firearm. And in fact, Cervantes was assaulted by a civilian. There were no other officers nearby. So the situation becomes, does Officer Ruff not respond to an officer who's alone with a civilian? Does he take time to secure his weapon when a fellow officer might need his aid or could be seriously injured in some circumstances? So the ideal scenario is that the long gun not be present, but oftentimes officers aren't dealing with an ideal scenario. And this was one of those situations where if you look at all the circumstances that were involved, he was it and he responded. Now, should he not have? Everyone can second guess each situation, but Officer Cervantes did need assistance, or Sergeant Cervantes did need assistance. And in fact, Sergeant Cervantes did suffer an injury which limited, as you noted in our report, limited his use to really only one arm, one hand to try and detain the suspect. Now, the long gun became an issue because Officer Ruff, in fact, only had one hand as well. So he had two officers, as we noted in the report, two officers with effectively two hands to be able to restrain the suspect.
Julie?
I had a question about the use of language. I was glad to see a comment about verbal engagement and sort of pointing out how words have an effect in terms of escalating or de-escalating from start to finish. And so I would appreciate one thing that wasn't mentioned, and I was curious if you could give some input on it, is the continued threats that Officer Ruff made that he was going to shoot the civilians. I think there were 4 times maybe that he said, essentially threatened to shoot them. And I wondered about that particular use of language and verbal engagement in terms of common practice.
Again, every situation is different. You'll note from the details of the report that commands are being given for the civilians to raise their hands, to raise their arms, to keep their arms away from their waist. And if you watch all of the videos, and there's many of them, there's the body-worn camera videos, there's the social media videos, the commands weren't being followed. What was the call? The call was a possible shooting. So we have a civilian who's identified themselves by name to the 911 dispatcher, given her name and given her address, who's stated that she saw the weapon, that she saw the cartridge fall out of the weapon, that she saw him put the weapon in his waistband. So we've got a lot of verification that there actually is an armed weapon. We had the report that someone heard a loud noise. There was the report that the subject might be injured. So there's a lot of information that the officers at the scene had that there may be a firearm that may be loaded, that may have been discharged. So the real concern for the officers, for officer safety and for all training, is that civilians who might be suspects keep their hands away from their waist area. The gun was reported to have been in his waist area. Keep their hands high in the air. Those commands were not being followed. If you read the detail, they were not being followed. So Officer Ruff's commands were repeated, and they were threats. And you'll note that Mr. Busby actually finally began to raise his hands high in the air after that threat was made the second or third time. Was that the language that made the difference, that caused him to put his hands in the air? We can't know that with certainty. But in terms of the threatening language, the purpose of the threatening language was to try and get him to follow the commands, because the commands weren't being followed prior to that.
Bill Brown.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate all the work you've put into this, and I think you've made some good recommendations. I had a couple questions. One, just clarification. You did say early on that our policy does have duty to intervene or intercede. I don't know if everybody realizes, but I think that refers to the duty of an officer who witnesses excessive force to intercede in that or report it. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. And then as far as the recommendations go, I know our use of force review board policy, it's like 301, I think, the one after the use of force policy, actually says that the board may recommend additional investigations or reviews or disciplinary investigations, training reviews, consider whether training should be developed or revised, and policy reviews. So they have the ability to basically make the recommendations that I think you guys have made a good start on as far as use of rifles, emphasizing consistency in verbal commands, positional asphyxia, things like that. So I guess my question is why didn't they do that, or should they have done that? Made those recommendations? Is it something they just didn't think of, they didn't notice? Did you point that out, that could have been handled better? I didn't see that in the report as far as how well the use of force review board did.
Yeah, if I can just briefly, also in that same use of force policy, there are 17 factors that are to be considered in terms of reasonableness for the use of force and evaluating whether use of force was reasonable. And when you look at the use of force review board's memorandum, they actually cite a lot of those factors as factors that they used in consideration. And that really appeared to be a real focus of theirs, is assessing the reasonableness and determining whether it was reasonable. We didn't get into a discussion with the use of force review board regarding our recommendations or what we saw, because that was the purpose of our final report to council and to the city. So in terms of that discussion, it didn't happen. We had an interview with members of the board, but we didn't tell them what our observations or thoughts were.
Okay, I appreciate that. I just, I know that in the review board basically just has two options to say the actions were within policy or they weren't within policy, but having this, also having this ability to recommend changes in policies or training reviews, things like that, I think would go a long way if they would use it to kind of fill in some of the gray areas we see in cases like this where it may be within policy, but it's not really what we would consider what we want our police to be doing on a regular basis. You know, it's not the best, might not have been the best way to handle it. So I would encourage our review board, I guess, to kind of look at that aspect and see if they could do more besides just say within policy or not within policy. Another question, as far as achieving accountability goes, did you, I guess you probably didn't look at the collective bargaining agreement we have, but is it common to see conflicts in the use of force policy or things we'd like to do with the policy and with what we're able to do through to be in agreement with the collective bargaining? And along the same lines, are you familiar with any Illinois pending legislation or proposed legislation that would also help with reducing the barriers to make police more accountable?
I will take part of that and then defer to the team if they have any addition on that. Is that, you know, collective bargaining agreements are often seen as the management tool for policing. And frankly, they really should be seen as what they are. It's protection within a contract perspective. Increasingly, we are seeing more transparency, more visibility, and frankly, more activism by municipalities, by communities in terms of what are the expectations for law enforcement around use of force reporting, right? So sometimes that's a crutch where it says the collective bargaining agreement prohibits X. And so it really is a question of identifying what is the end goal and then how do we get there in terms of transparency and information. And I think that in Illinois, we're seeing a greater focus on transparency. We're seeing FOIA challenges that I think somebody asked earlier about more timely release of body-worn cameras. But I think that in a healthy environment, those key concerns that are barriers to transparency or to procedure are discussed with, the department, and the collective bargaining procedures as they apply are followed. But there are options for agencies and municipalities to ensure that there is consistency and transparency. And I think that if you look at various agencies within Illinois, you'll see differing practices based upon community appetite and, frankly, the engagement between the department and bodies such as yours. And so where barriers are claimed, the factual review of what it is and what does it mean, and at the end of the day, what is the end goal and how do we get there? Ideally through agreement, and if not, the collective bargaining agreement stands as a tool for negotiation. But you do have actions within the state of Illinois around investigations into use of force. You have legislature that continues to be active. Marcia, are you aware of any specific events happening currently in the legislature?
Unfortunately, I'm not for Illinois, but I know nationally there has been a lot of push, particularly during this climate, to change legislation for accountability measures, but I'm not sure what's going on right here in Illinois.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I'll have one more question, and I'll let others go. In the narrative kind of description of the incident that you have in the report, it sounded like, in some places you actually say you got that from a police report, and there were a couple of times where, I don't have it in front of me, somebody thought, I think maybe one of them was when they thought that she might have a weapon. That had to come from the police report because you couldn't tell that from looking at the video. As far as the reasonableness of that belief goes, when someone's moving around like that and is in this kind of tussle and then on the ground wearing the clothes she was wearing, was it a reasonable belief for the officer to think that she had a gun? Wouldn't it have fallen out or been more apparent if she'd had a gun at that stage?
I could take that. You'll note that it wasn't, when they had first contact with Ms. Lewis, they didn't know that a gun had been found on the other civilian. As they were engaging with Ms. Lewis, they were responding to possible shots fired from a credible 911 caller who had identified themselves. And they were engaged with two suspects. They had one subject in custody. They didn't know where the gun was. And guns can be concealed anywhere, in a shoe, in the crotch area. Guns can be small. They can be small 22 Derringers. They can fit in the palm of your hand. They can be in a back pocket. So that's their training tells them this. And so for them, to answer your question, yes, it's reasonable for them to have believed that. In reference to your report, the vast majority of what's in that narrative comes from the actual audio from all these various videos that have more or less synced together, as well as what's seen from all these videos synced together. Where there were statements that fit in there somewhere, but came from a report, they were put in there and it was attributed to the report for clarification purposes. But back to your question, yes, it's certainly reasonable for an officer to believe that there could be a gun.
Okay, thanks. And I did appreciate the detail in that. I think there were several things that I didn't catch when I watched the videos myself, and I've watched them several times. So I appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
Dennis, you were actually raising your hand about the same time that Bill had raised his.
Actually, Mary Alice has raised her hand a couple of times.
Are you
I had two
deferring to
questions.
Mary Alice?
I had two questions, perhaps. One is in the overview, it looks like your recommendation is that the police have been following their policy that's established. And then your recommendations require or suggest that there are improvements in certain areas, very specific areas that can be made, which I think are very smart and well spoken, because I think these are the things that occurred to me as I watched the video. The public, when they watch the videos that are available, feel outraged. And would you say that that they have good reason to feel very upset, having watched what appeared to be happening, even though we know that it was following police procedure? But I don't know if it's fair to ask that or not, but I'm wondering what your take was as you watched. Were you concerned? Did you feel that there was an unfortunate incident that could have been perhaps avoided?
I think that there's always concern when you have a police use of force in any incident, right? And so the policy and the training and the perspective is important. When we identify what are the community perspectives on use of force, what we are dealing with are two things, right? There's that transparency around the expectations that officers have when they respond to an incident, and then two, education to the community about what those expectations are. Where there's a belief, perception, or well-founded understanding that use of force is not used appropriately, particularly within certain communities, that contributes to the overall angst and concern within communities. But as any police professional and as a community member and as a resident of Illinois, anytime you look at a police use of force, the goal is to examine it and to identify how to limit and decrease the potential need for force in the next incident. And so a well-functioning board is identified by Mr. Brown, who's looking at what are our policies, how do we improve it, and that is the goal of a board generally in this circumstance, is to be able to identify how do we address this and how do we take that forward. I think the voice of the community and the concern is one that we hear nationally and is resonating, and it has value and it should be listened to. And I think that the city, in requesting an independent review of the practice and opening itself up for the recommendations and discussions with its community member, has demonstrated a commitment to continue to improve police practices. But at the end of the day, the challenge is that there was always not always, but when a use of force incident does occur, the question is it justified, and is there force proportionate to the incident? And that's really the key standard. And if that is met, have we been able to, as a community, as a police department, identify how and when we'll use force and limit that use of force in a way that is most appropriate? And when we talk about duty to intervene, de-escalation, those are also force tools that allow us to be able to reduce the need for force. And I think that out of all of it is what we see as a hopeful path forward here in Urbana, is that you have an agency in a city that is committed to that and is working towards that.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is it was interesting that you identified one of the issues that occurred to you is that you found a lack of de-escalation language being used by the officers. They were following pretty much the use of force triangle, but there wasn't really, they hadn't really been versed in de-escalation options that would take the person down the triangle to the base rather than up to the point where there would be potential tragedy or an occurrence that we would really regret. So I really appreciate your perspective on that and recommendation that language be introduced into the current policies. And also I even had several conversations actually with Mike Schlossler, who is the head of the training at the U of I Police Training Institute. He had presented to us a diagram of explaining the use of force protocol in the police department that he trained in, and I asked him, well, where are the de-escalation commands, which, should be right next to the ones that are taking us forward rather than, and he said, you know what, well, we never actually put those in the document. And we're going to have to redesign that slide so that we actually introduce that. And you identified the fact that we don't have any use of force de-escalation clauses in our current document. So that's something I really want to see happen.
Yeah, and as you've identified, that's something that you're seeing nationally with policing, is that it is.
Yeah, it's a new consciousness that we're finding out that, yeah, okay, there's a lack here, and that we have work to do to patch this crack. The other thing is, it's kind of maybe speculative, but you know, our officers are also permitted to carry tasers. A taser was not introduced into this scenario, but would it have been an appropriate implement to reduce the conflict that they were having with this one individual to display a taser and suggest that perhaps that would be used? Is that a less risk of force or use of force than what you had seen? I think I'm trying to evaluate really how we use tasers in this community and what would be an appropriate place in this scenario that taser might be introduced, or was there none?
When you talk about use of taser, taser is often seen as a less lethal option. And so in terms of the circumstance presented to the officers, at least initially at that time, they felt that they were dealing with an armed individual. By the time that they had placed Ms. Lewis in restraints, tasing her would not have been appropriate. And so the actions subsequent were, in fact, attempting to minimize some of the force used there. Tasers remain challenging and controversial in some communities. And in some communities, they're more strongly embraced as a means of optionally less lethal force, but they do have lethality attached to them. And so when dealing with what is anticipated to be an armed individual, you know, the force training also identifies, you know, that officers are able to respond with an armed response.
Well, it's something we probably will want to look at again, maybe rephrase our policy. Thank you.
Mary Alice. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for your report. I did learn things that, even though I've watched those videos countless times, read lots of reports, the one big thing that we've had the community talk a lot about is what were we responding to? So it was the first time that I had seen that the actual text of the 911 call that went out, the dispatch that went out to the police, which was that there was a possible shooting and somebody harmed. And that was the first time that I had seen that, because it's a translation, right? So you have a community member who calls into 911, then the 911 operator translates that to dispatch. And so that piece was missing. So I appreciate the thoroughness of that information. One thing that really struck me, and I know that people have already talked a lot about it, but I just kind of want to emphasize, right now we're in a reactive stance. We've had a use of force, that there's been a lot of questions in terms of the appropriateness of it. And rather than being reactive, I'd much rather see our city be proactive about this. So to that end, I mean, I think it is a very large gap that we don't have de-escalation in our use of force policies, but of course, policing changes and the culture changes. And so do you have a recommendation in terms of how frequently we should be reviewing this specific policy, the use of force, so that we can stay abreast of exactly what we should be working on? I don't know if that's a Deborah or a Mark question.
Yeah, I'm going to move that to Marcia, and then I'll follow up with that response afterwards.
Well, our standard is that you should review them annually with particularly use of force. The laws change a lot too, and I'm not sure, again, specifically to Illinois. I'm not an Illinois lawyer, so I don't keep up as much with Illinois changes as my colleagues might who are licensed here. But I know with departments that we've looked at across the country, annual reviews of your policies to see if there are any changes in procedures, updates, national sentiment, best practices, all of those things should be reviewed. And particularly your legal community can come in, your attorneys that work with the city to do a legal review. I know we've done them annually in the departments that I've worked in to make sure all the policies are updated, particularly use of force, because that one, again, is one that could cause the department a lot of liability. As well as if the officers are not kept up to date on the nuances of, as Bill Brown and Dennis presented, some of the things that maybe would have been updated in the policies. And also national standards change, not just the laws, but kind of the standard and the flow for where use of force is going. I know there's quite a few of standards, CALEA standards, as well as DOJ standards that come out that we look at quite frequently, we call best and next practices. So again, my suggestion would be at least annually, and particularly if laws come out in between your annual review, sometimes they have to be done even sooner than that.
And commensurate with updating your policies is reviewing your training, because as Mr. Roberts identified, many agencies have jumped on to some of the language that is really being used around use of force and the idea of minimizing force, but being able to place that into your training. And sometimes it's not as easy or as flexible as it could be for agencies. And so that's part of the challenge. So an annual review would allow for more frequent updating of training as well.
It would also allow for what Bill had suggested in terms of reviewing what items should be re-looked at during a use of force review. Okay. Thank you. I'll let others ask their questions. I think Sharice was.
Sharice?
Yeah. I know one of the issues regarding language used that would sound patronizing, which would probably get my back up too. My question is that what language, or what do you have an example at least of words that would maybe specifically deal with a person taking it to de-escalation so that it doesn't sound patronizing?
Well,
they ask several times, for her to relax, for her to calm down, stop moving, stop resisting. Those are the commands that were used. Anything else that could bring more on a human level, more on a level where you're, I don't think that the officer was purposefully being patronizing or condescending. I think that he just couldn't think of a nice way to say, once again, calm down. So what kind of examples do you have that would not be in that kind of tone?
Well, the report cites, I think, two examples in particular. One was in reference to Ms. Lewis not acting like a lady, and then the tone and the way it was said and the words that were chosen. The other one was when she said that she was going to leave, and the type of words that were chosen. If you're fixing to go home, you're fixing to go to jail. So it's word choice, it's word tone, it's appropriateness, and for them to be used the way they were used, in the context they were used, in the situation they were used, when you clearly have an agitated person who maybe had already been exhibiting some behaviors consistent with use of substances or other issues. Those are the types of word choices or phrases that potentially can inflame the situation. So not using those words or those phrases would be a first start. But we're dealing, as you said yourself, you're dealing with adrenaline rush. You're dealing with the urgency of the situation. So that's why training is so critical.
So what kind of words would you recommend then? I mean, just an example of what could have been said in place of act like a lady, for example.
Well, there's another example where Ms. Lewis made a statement and the officer responded, well, that's just not true. You don't want to be in any way argumentative or having a disagreement with the subject about things that are not directly germane and germane to safety and security and the incident. So there's things you just want to clearly avoid. Instead of saying, you need to start acting like a lady because you're clearly not acting in a lady, make statements that relate to, we want to treat you with dignity and respect. We're asking that you calm down. speak like you would want to be spoken to.
Okay, so if the officer had said something to the effect of, I don't want you to hurt yourself, or I don't want to inadvertently hurt you. So if you could calm down and so that we can talk.
Yeah, those are great examples.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Julie?
Yeah, I had a question about the evolving thinking about these conflicts that are between, different bodies and affect bodies. One thing we saw in your report was several descriptions of the injury that the officer received to his thumb, which sounded pretty serious. But we don't hear about if there were any injuries to Ms. Lewis. And I was wondering if that, in terms of, I guess I'm not sure how to ask it, but in terms of policy, in terms of the overall assessment of what was reasonable use of force in instances like these, taking into consideration the effect that it has on the body of the person who is being, who's being, force is being used against them, I think is something that, of course, in this instance made it even more upsetting for so many people to see this young woman who was quite small, with, as we all know. But yeah, so sorry, it's not a very clear question, but I just was wondering what evolving thinking there is about how to include those kinds of questions in use of force.
Well, I mean, in terms of the 17 factors that are in the current use of force policy for the police department, that should be reviewed by the officer in terms of determining reasonableness of whether to use force, and also by the review board in determining whether use of force was reasonable. That's one of the factors that's in there. One of the factors that's in there is, the physical size of the threat of the person. The other factors that are in there that certainly related in this situation, for example, were injuries with Officer Cervantes, the thumb injury it is. So many of these factors, particularly if you start piling them up on top of each other, one of them is the seriousness of the offense. The call was, a possible shooting. Another was, was one officer or an officer possibly injured. Another was, so that you start adding those all together, and they are taken into account. Or the policy requests that the officer requires the officer take those into account. And the policy also requires that the review board consider them when determining whether the force was reasonable.
Jared.
So I got a couple more questions, but one thing that I didn't get to finish asking in my first round about the rifle, I wanted to go over quickly. In y'all's experience, if a rifle or just generally an errant discharge of a firearm that's not correctly handled by an officer, does that responsibility generally fall on that officer, the police department, the city? Who ends up being responsible in that situation? I'm asking because it probably is important in consideration of any changes we have in our use of force policy, especially in adopting policy about the use of service rifles, that we need to be conscious of who's at fault if an officer fails to control their weapon and it ends up incidentally being fired.
What that's classified as is, if it's not intentional, it's an unintentional discharge. I can't give you advice about liability, but if it's within the line of duty, ultimately it does come to the employer in most circumstances. And so that's why we identify control of the rifle, but frankly, any weapon. When an officer goes hands-on with somebody, the ability to control that weapon becomes important. And when you're dealing with two, it becomes a little bit more challenging.
And there are a lot of sub-issues, you've made reference to some of them already, Mr. Miller, but we make reference in the report to the type of sling that was used with this weapon, for example. There are side slings, there are forward slings, there are rear slings, and what type of duty sling is used with the rifle can very much impact the ability to control the rifle and the ability to keep the rifle out from in front of you. So those are the kinds of factors that I think would be looked at in training.
Okay. Another thing that I wanted to ask is that there's part of this, it's a little confusing to me in officer actions that were taken by Sergeant Cervantes in his decision to engage and go after Miss Lewis as Mr. Busby passed and is being taken into custody. Bill went over this a couple of times, and we've kind of established that we believe that the officer, Sergeant Cervantes, believed that she may still be armed. At that point, he doesn't know if she has the gun, if Kamarian has the gun. If either of them have the gun, it's unknown of the whereabouts. But we don't see anything mentioned as far as his decision to come out from behind cover and holster his weapon in pursuit of her when she turns, refusing his command to keep walking towards her. And, you see him turn to check on the other officers. He turns back, and she is now actually facing him again. But he's out from behind his cover, and he's holstered his weapon and advances towards her. It would be my understanding that he should not have ever have come out from behind the vehicle while they attempted to gain compliance, because at that time she was still, not following orders per se. She was sort of following orders, but also being verbally resistant. So I'm interested in why that wasn't directly addressed as him coming out from behind the car while still dealing with an armed subject. Is that inappropriate? Is that, appropriate part of policy? I'm interested why we didn't see anything about that.
Well, it kind of goes back to our asks at the beginning to some extent, in that our mandate was to review the sufficiency of the use of force investigation by the department and to review the use of force policies. And we veered off from that. If you note, we've gone into a lot of different areas. We talk about verbal engagement, control of the rifle. Really, if the engagement was to review all tactics and law enforcement procedures, this could be a much longer report, and it could be many more months in the coming. So we're trying to stay within scope. There are a lot of attachments and appendices to our report that
most of which we cannot see, by the way. The city has only allowed us to see 3 of the appendices, and all 3 of them are of no consequence. They don't contain any useful information. They contain links to the videos that we already have. So I don't know what's in those. And so that's why I'm asking these questions, because I can't compare and contrast those things. I can't read those appendices.
Sure. In Officer Cervantes's report, he does delve into that. And to the extent that we read that and were satisfied with it, it was not another tactical or procedural issue that we wanted to go too far down a path with, considering that we were still trying to stay on point on the main mandate, which was the sufficiency review and the use of force.
Okay. I'm sure you guys have come across situations like this in engagement, and this is just part of a larger discussion of engagements that I was hoping to at least get some answers from you guys on. I think one of the big discussions that we're having here in our community, and especially related to this, is what there is a clear lack of effort made for de-escalation in this, at least to a lot of folks. I think anyone would have a hard time arguing that there was plenty of de-escalation techniques used in this incident. And I'm often concerned about resistant civilians when they encounter police officers, because if a police officer encounters someone, and I don't want to go into too many hypotheticals, I'm just laying out, a general sense for you, encounter someone and they do not do as the officer says, where in your experience, and Mark, you seem to be pretty informed on this, where in your experience what can we point to draw those lines between how much liberty officers have to gain control over a situation, especially with somebody who's being resistant, whether that's verbally resistant or physically resistant, and needing to gain control over a situation, even if it is a dangerous situation. You know, this entire incident unfolded over the span of about 10 minutes from the time the officers arrived to the time that Miss Lewis ends up in the back of the squad car, and in even less time from the time that the officers arrive to the time that she is approached by Sergeant Cervantes and taken down. You know, it's less than a minute. It's probably about 30 seconds. And if Sergeant Cervantes had waited, you know, 40 more seconds, even though she had turned away and was refusing commands, where is she going to go? She's in the middle of the street. You know, maybe this doesn't happen. They find the gun on him. They decide, okay, well, we found our armed subject. Now we can, you know, let's approach this a little bit differently. So that, you know, we're kind of in this, you know, constant struggle of trying to figure out where that balance is. And I'm just interested in your thoughts. Are there tools? Are there other situations out there that you guys can bring back to us? I know you're going to come back with some of the things that we've asked questions about to give us further advice on it. So I hope all that makes sense. Because that's why I'm asking these questions about should he have come out behind the car.
Yeah, and so Mr. Miller, I think that when we talk about the level of community engagement and what the discussion was for the path forward, is that the types of questions that you're raising weren't solid answers. And within the hypothetical of what if in this circumstance, we can't answer that. But understanding what are the policies, the procedures, and what are the expectations of the department going forward should be the outcome of the engagement that we're identifying. When we talk about where we sit today versus where the officers sat that day, we have the advantage of hindsight. We have the advantage of reviewing all the videos and listening to the 911 tapes. And so in some regards, that's why is where it's at, right? It's what is the officer viewing at the time that they're engaged. And had they waited that 30 seconds, we know today, perhaps what would have happened. But had Ms. Lewis be armed, had this happened, it could be potentially another circumstance. And that's why the training for officers is so important, as well as the integration of officers, the concepts of use of force, and working with community to establish community standards is important, because these are really complex issues. And we're at a time of change, I believe, as it relates to law enforcement practices. And that the more robust, informed communities allow for decisions that are reflecting the standards that they want to see. And so when we talk about tools such as tasers and rifles and weapons, they're there for a real purpose. How they get used and what those decision processes are come through training, and visibility on those trainings and policies helps you become more informed, and also helps the community become more informed and to develop the expectations and the standards going forward for officer use of force. And so I understand that these are the challenges of our time. And as we look at that, what are the expectations? And so we do see nationally crisis intervention training, right? Some agencies have trained every officer on the full 40-hour program so that they're better trained in dealing with persons who are under some form of intoxication or disability as it relates to rational thought. What are those things that are effective for de-escalation? But as Mark identified, the 17 factors that is used as part of the review is sufficient and does allow for a determination in terms of what are the legal standards and the policies that exist. And so as we go forward and as the city of Urbana goes forward, it's able to start to craft and have a conversation with its agency. And so that's what we intend our report to be the foundation for. And we hope it has value for the community to help reduce incidents such as these in terms of the severity and the need for use of force.
I'll wait for further questions.
Dennis, I'll recognize you. Then after you're done, I'd like to pass the chair over to you so I can actually ask the question. But Dennis, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Something we haven't talked about, and I'm a little bit curious about your perspective of, is how important it is it to have a force that more thoroughly reflects the racial breakdown of people of color on the force. Should it be a factor in the success of interactions between civilians and the police, or should policy be sufficient and officer racial identity be either more important for a community to enhance engagement with the community, or is it really just the attitude of that human being who's approaching a suspect and how they manage it?
Well, I would say it's a combination of both, right? We recognize the need for diversity within law enforcement organizations, particularly as we deal with the perceptions and frankly, the engagement of the criminal justice system with communities of color. And so progressive agencies are really looking at increasing diversity in their staff and increasing their ability to engage with diverse communities. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is nationally is it's becoming increasingly more challenging to recruit, and you're seeing a lot of agencies cross-competing in terms of qualified officers and particularly officers with specific skill sets. And so fundamentally, diversity in a law enforcement organization is an overarching goal and should be delivered, and frankly, is something that most agencies are working toward. But at the end of the day, you know, individuals aside, making sure that whomever is employed by the municipality, by the law enforcement, by the public safety agency, is that there are standards and requirements for effective and productive policing, and officers should be held to account for those standards. And so even if diversity is a challenge, recruiting individuals that have an open perspective, that are willing to engage with the community, and really frankly looking at some of the skill sets that you recruit are some of the issues that are being examined nationally for law enforcement. And so hiring people is your first step to ensuring a cultural competency and appropriate engagement with your community. Marcia, anything I missed?
Not for myself.
So you hit all the points that I would have thought as well, Deb. I agree, it's both. So when you can hire for certain competencies, and I believe that, as Deb mentioned, they are evolving those competencies that we may have recruited for historically. For police officers, I think people are looking at different competency sets as well as that diversity. So thanks for the question, Dennis.
Okay, Dennis, I'd like to pass the chair to you for a second.
Certainly, then. And so, Bill, would you like to speak?
Yes. One of the important tenets is community engagement. We as a council, I believe, think community engagement is critically important. We hear week after week, day after day from the constituents of Urbana and the surrounding area about community engagement. And as part of this process, community engagement was integral as well, and you guys spoke directly to that. The city had provided 50 groups or leads, so to speak, and according to your report, only 18 responded. That's only a 36% success rate of getting people engaged. And I'm curious, did we not provide the right names? What was the reason from your perspective that only 18 of 50 actually engaged in this process?
You know, Bill, that is a great question. I'm not quite sure what the lack of responsiveness was. I know that the names that were provided seemed to come from a great representation across the city. I did look at the names and the organizations. Obviously, I didn't know the individuals, so they were names that were provided to me. The invitations went out, I believe, in a very timely fashion to all of the people that were on the list, many of whom, if we didn't have correct information for, we went back and actually did some research to try to get the information. I think out of the entire 50, only maybe one we weren't able to actually get an accurate email address for. So I'm not quite sure. It could have been many factors, and I'd be remiss if I added, what if, just kind of like what Deb said. We don't know why people didn't respond. I didn't get bounce backs. So they did receive the invitation to continue the conversation, and my understanding is that the people that were on the list were people who were thoughtful folks about the city and also had concerns about what happened. And we definitely invited them to the table to continue the conversation. So I really don't know. I've seen it in other cities where, you invite people to the table and sometimes they don't come to the table, maybe reluctancy that things may not happen, or just didn't have the opportunity to those 3 days that we offered. Could be various reasons, but I have no idea. But as far as I know, only one person didn't get the email invitation to the event.
Is there any opinion that you would have? So there's 3 sessions. If there was 4 or 5 or 6, would we have cast a wider net and caught more people than, or more groups than 18?
I know the time constraints. I know that when we worked with the city, that we did add additional time to get the invitation out, because that was one of the things that we started out with. The concern was if we put the invitation out and it would be a week later. So we did extend the time for people to sign up for the 3 sessions. With 50 people, I don't know if extending it out any further would have gotten more people. Again, the responses were only 20 responses, so that's why I said out of the 50, we got 20 responses. So it only 18 did show up for the session. So the other 2 obviously apologized for not being able to make their session for various reasons. But I don't know, Bill. I don't know if we have extended the time or anything like that. I can't say. I mean, we've had other cities we work with where we've announced sessions to the public months, and we've gotten small responses as well. So there may be no factor, or there may be various factors that we can't identify. So it works. We've got other ones we've had 300 people show up. So it really does vary. But we hope that they continue to come. The people who did come, again, I appreciated their input. I thought they gave some very valuable insight that we shared in the report. We tried to share as much as we could that were themes that came out of those 3 sessions. And we would hope that the conversations continues. That was the theme, was continue the conversation. So I hope that as a result of our report going out and the willingness of the city to have these conversations, that people will continue to come forward and have these discussions, particularly about these issues that you guys are raising today, and that our report identified as ongoing concerns for the community.
Thank you. And that was the last question that I had.
I return the chairmanship to you then.
Thank you, sir. Mary Alice, before I recognize you, I just want to point out the time. It's 8:59, almost 9 o'clock. We talked about the timeline today. Not only do I want to be respectful of this conversation while we have Hilliard Heinz with us and all the questions you guys have directly of them, I just want to remind everybody that we've got a couple ordinance to get through, and then we have our own council discussion before we get to public input. So I just want to point that out. So Mary Alice.
I'll try to make my question brief. I wanted to expand a little bit on what Julie had asked about, which is injury to the person in which use of force was used on. There's been several people in the community who have stated that there was an injury to Miss Lewis, and I'm wondering if there was injury, how would that appear in the reports, and how would that be used in a use of force investigation?
In terms of injuries to Miss Lewis, we didn't see any injuries documented. The booking photographs didn't display an injury. The jail intake information didn't document injury. During her interview, recorded interview in an unrelated matter, the day after the event, she was speaking clearly, coherently, had a significant and long conversation with another officer who was unrelated to this incident. She didn't make any comments or complaints or proclamations about an injury at that time. So we're not aware of any injuries that occurred to her.
If there was injury, how would it be recorded in a use of force review?
Yeah, the injury would be taken into account just in terms of the review. The force that was used, in this case, there was one strike with a fist, there was one strike with a knee. What impact did that have on the person? On the second use of force, the strike with the knee, after that, they were able to handcuff Miss Lewis. They were able to control her hands enough to handcuff Miss Lewis. But injuries are looked at as part of a use of force investigation. In our case, we're doing a sufficiency review. So we wouldn't be doing an investigation in terms of interviewing and looking at, we would be looking at what the investigating officer or supervisor looked at and what the review board looked at in terms of the injury. And then we would just review it, whether we thought the review was sufficient.
So just to be clear, that would mean that if somebody is injured from a police person, that would be part of the record, and it would be also part of the use of force review board if there was an injury that occurred to somebody. I just wanted to be clear, is that part of our process? Or do you not know? That's okay if you don't know. I wanted to know if you.
So the reason it is part of the process is that use of force policies require that those who are injured through use of force be rendered aid. So what we commonly see in our engagements is we're reviewing whether aid was rendered. So if someone suffered a broken elbow, was aid rendered immediately? Was EMS called to get them to the hospital? So there was no component that was part of the department's use of force review that examined the rendering of aid as part of use of force.
Thank you.
Mayor?
Just one quick question, since we seem to be wrapping up. In your report, you note that our department is certified by the Illinois Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board, but you used national standards like CALIA or ILEAP. Is accreditation something in addition to certification by the Illinois Law Enforcement Boards, or is it a higher standard? Or how do those two standards compare?
So when we look at accreditation, what it is nationally identifying what are the standards emerging in law enforcement. And so because CALIA is sometimes seen as a higher standard, but it is also a body of practice for which many law enforcement organizations review and seek to achieve. CALIA is recognized. We also use the International Association of Chiefs of Police Standards on the consensus on the use of force. For those areas where we used the CALIA factor standards, those are areas where we see nationally that you're starting to gain traction. And so as we identified, there are aspects of the UPD's use of force policy that are consistent and that comport with national and Illinois standards. And where we identify in policy, it really is meant to be improvements to the existing practices of the organization.
So it's not a choice of either, is it a choice of you either go for CALIA or ILEAP, or you go for the Illinois Law Enforcement Board?
Right. So the Law Enforcement Training Standards Board provides basic recommendations around training and force practices. And so basically by comporting with the law in Illinois, which UPD does, you achieve those standards. When you look at something like CALIA and I think it's ILEAP within Illinois, which is the accreditation practice in Illinois, you are looking at what are identified as standards that not only comport nationally, but also provide risk management protection for those agencies that adopt them, because they are part of a nationally accredited association with there's annual validation, and I think every 3 years there's an audit of those standards and practices. Mark and Marcia, if I've misstated any of them, please.
Thank you.
Jared?
So just to piggyback real quick off Mary Alice before I make a comment. Mary Alice, the two sections on pages 27 and 28 that cover canvassing and interviewing subjects on whom force was used kind of answer your questions, both of which were recommendations that our police department was not engaging in either practice other than it said that a supervisor did attempt to interview Ms. Lewis twice while she was in custody, presumably at jail in the county jail. And they believe she was under a substance, but then did not subsequently attempt to interview her further. So, we never saw that in any of the reporting, so they didn't have it to consider, nor were interviews of witnesses other than the witness who posted the video, that we heard about with Hugger and the woman who had the bullet come in through her window. Other interviews weren't conducted, so those are both recommendations that are things that should have been done following the use of force, or part of the use of force review. Do I have that right, Deborah, Mark?
Well, the policy of the department is that the supervisor who's conducting the use of force investigation may interview witnesses.
Right, and your language says they should.
We're saying that it should be required, so that's correct.
Yes, right. Must, not may, but must. And Marcia, I just wanted to share a comment with you, since you and I were not able to connect after my participation in one of the interviews and ask a question, I guess generally of garnering public input. Do you feel like in incidents such as this that 4.5 hours, and I remember our session pretty thoroughly. I was taking notes throughout, and we really had this is constructive criticism if you take it as such. We really didn't get a lot of time for us to share what we wanted to talk about from that questionnaire. That questionnaire was pretty broad in the questions that were asked in it, and I understand you're probably just trying to get a sense of things in there, and these were some of the concerns I was hoping to share with you if we had had a chance to connect. But I mean, as somebody who's engaged in these sort of issues, I could have spent an hour and a half talking to you about any one of those long form answer questions, and to try and give a one sentence summary to some of those complex issues and have a meaningful discussion with community members in such a short period of time. I found it to be pretty difficult to try and get a good point across and have a good conversation about it. And I'm just curious, is this a standard that Hilliard Hines uses? Is 4.5 hours of time, even though all of that wasn't dedicated to actually getting feedback. A good chunk of it was your presentation to us, explaining some, police tactics and police verbiage and why we were here, and then we read every question on the survey. Is that general practice, where I'm just curious?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's one technique for community engagement, learning session, and that particular tool was used for this engagement because we had a group of select folks identified to have the conversation, as well as 9 themes to discuss, versus a listening session, which would have been more around the incident, the issues, where we would have given adequate time just to hear community feedback, which is a different form of community engagement. And there's a whole spectrum of community engagement. One is, inform, one is to involve, one is to collaborate, one would be to empower. And there's a whole spectrum of things that we do at Hilliard Hines, depending on the need of the city and the request of the clients. But to answer your question about the time constraints, the learning sessions are set for an hour and a half. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. Sometimes I get feedback from people that say, an hour and a half, we're gonna talk that long? And then we end up staying on the phone for 3 hours if time will permit. But that's one of the reasons why we do give a fillable PDF format for all of those questionnaires. And I would say subsequent to many of well, at least 2 of the sessions that we had, people did send their PDF forms to me afterwards because they wanted to spend more time individually, which I always offer up front, that if you have more time or more things that you want to share, that you can send me that PDF. It's still non-attributional, but they can send that to me. And so we did receive numerous PDFs completed by individuals after the sessions because they wanted to take more time to deliberate. And we also give that form out a day in advance so that people want to read through it and answer the questions as well, even though we try to give time during the sessions. But the sessions themselves lend themselves for a good conversation, and sometimes they go over the time and people want to talk more. And that's one reason why we say, please feel free to send it in later. And as you said, sometimes we connect afterwards as well. So I know I did get quite a few after our sessions, but we would love to give as much time as possible for community engagement. And again, that's just one tool, one technique. So to answer your question, as much engagement as you can do as a city is what I would encourage. I would encourage you to build in other opportunities to talk to the community, give the opportunity to the community to have a voice. Our specifically a learning session is about those 9 themes and about this particular scenario and was to educate because there were questions that came out of those 9 themes. And so we chose that tool for this particular phase of the review. But absolutely, you can definitely have additional dialogue, and I would encourage the city to do so. But I would not say that limiting conversations is anything that we encourage as a firm. We definitely want to say we expand conversations. But this particular one, well, we schedule them for an hour and a half. But we definitely say afterwards you can send those forms into us so that we can get your feedback. So you can take as much time as you need to give me the feedback. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to connect, Jared. I still would love to talk to you if we have time.
And may I ask though, or may I add that as a company, we recognize that we deliver a report and it's the recommendations within the report that help to foster and further develop the community dialogue on issues, particularly such as use of force. I mean, here tonight, we've spent over 2 hours discussing this with a highly engaged, highly informed unit. And so when we start looking at the multiple perspectives across communities, we recognize that a single report or whatever level of engagement is not going to be sufficient within the regards of delving down into and solving those issues. And so the goal and the point was to provide information and to provide a framework for the city to take our recommendations into account.
Deborah, am I to understand that we are going to see you guys again, though, at some point in the future as a follow-up?
I will defer to the city in that regard. It is our goal to be able to continue to support the city of Urbana on this because we believe that you guys are in a good position to really improve and really continue to develop what we believe to be a nice foundation based on actions taken by the department and frankly, the level of engagement by the community.
Well, I guess a question for you, Diane.
The answer is yes, we have that option. And in fact, we had planned on additional follow-up. And let me add on to the point about the 9 themes. We, if you recall, I solicited feedback from each council member asking each of you what you had heard over the weeks and weeks of public comment and what you saw as emerging from that comment, what were the major areas of concern. And from those, and then I had taken copious notes all along as well and went back and actually watched some of the public input again. So emerging from the weeks of input and feedback and comments we had received already, we used those 9 areas as a starting point, and that's how this particular engagement was structured. I can send you all a list of the folks who were invited. You also provided me names. Many of the names that you gave me and suggested be included in the community engagement piece were invited. We couldn't put everybody in there just because of the numbers, but many, many, many were included, and it was a pretty broad representation. So we do have the option going forward of more sessions. This would be in addition to what has been spent already, so that's a consideration too. Or we can go in a different direction in terms of how you want to do engagement. But I think it's pretty clear that this report and everything we've heard tonight, is the first step, and that's very clear. And we have a lot to work with coming out of this report.
Sounds like we're kind of wrapping up. Does anybody on the council have any critical questions that need to be asked tonight that could not be asked at a possible later session?
I just have one quick one, Bill, if I could. Because it's for Hillard Hines. So one thing that I was curious about in the contract that I wanted to ask you all about is that I know a draft report is supplied to the city to review prior to this final reports that we receive to be checked for errors and or other edits. I'm just curious what kind of errors and edits are normally spotted by cities that are given back to you guys. I mean, I'm curious why council wasn't able to see the draft and also review that as well. We're only being able to see the final report. What's that is that common practice to do that? Just curious.
So I can speak to our practice elsewhere, and if Mark has something to add, he can here, is that what we find with our reports, particularly when they go public, is that if we are not factually accurate about structures, or if we missed even basic things such as the name of a responding unit, if we misidentified what a call code was in terms of our response, it really diminishes the overall quality and perception of the report. Because if there's one error there, then particularly on controversial issues, we are subject to greater, and frankly, challenges in terms of the overall accuracy of the report, as well as its acceptance within the community. And so our practice is to identify a subject matter expert with limited access to the report, and really fact-checking, locations, times, dates, making sure that we have the information. There's a lot of information that comes forward in the recent reports. We are not imbued in the city of Urbana, although I am an old Illini, but making sure that we identify factually accurate information, and that's what we're looking at. We will never alter our findings or our recommendations based on initial draft. And so when we do talk about factual accuracy, it really is making sure that we've identified the right policies, that we are referencing the right standards, the right response units, even call numbers. You know, when you deal with dispatch, they have different numbers and different outcomes. And so making sure that, the basic factual information is accurate, because if it's not, then that undermines the overall quality and frankly, value of any report we deliver. And so that is a company practice and approach. And in this instance, it was never a full draft. It was within pieces of the framework and validating the questions that we had to ensure that we had factual accuracy.
Okay, Ms. Kirby, Ms. Thompson, Mr. Giuffre, on behalf of the council, thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts tonight, and we appreciate you coming to council tonight and giving your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Okay, next on the agenda is the staff report. And I know there was not going to be a staff report, but Mayor, did you have any comments that you had in this section?
No.
Okay. Next on the agenda is ordinance number 2020-09-044, ratification of extension of emergency order number 20-03, temporary suspension of issuance of special events permits.
Yes, and I believe the clerk had a correction to the title, and if I remember right, the ordinance title should be an ordinance to ratify extension of emergency order. Is that correct?
Actually, what it says, Mayor, is an ordinance ratifying extending emergency order 2003, emergency order phase 4 operating guidelines, temporarily suspending the issuance of special event permits.
Okay, so that is the title when the motion is made that should be used. Okay. Yes, this is simply an extension of the ordinance that you passed earlier that suspends issuing public events permits, and this goes through November 1st, 2020. And it is consistent with the order that was done in Champaign to that same date. So this applies to public events, events on public property where a public event permit normally would have been issued, or any events involving the sale or service or consumption of alcohol on public property.
So with Dennis.
So Mayor, having just experienced a great event outside of the Rose Bowl Tavern, in which the Folk and Roots, CU Folk and Roots group provided performances outdoors under a tent with social distancing, but also the serving of beverages. Would that make such a gathering and musical event now impossible for the rest of the duration until the end of November?
No, the Rose Bowl has a Class A liquor license, and they have the use of that tent, and so that is under their control. So yes, they're using public property, but it's through the liquor license that they have.
Okay, so it's not a special event that's disassociated with a liquor license.
No. Special event is a one-time event or maybe event for 2 or 3 days, but the Rose Bowl is a licensed liquor establishment.
Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that.
Complying very well with COVID-19 guidelines, I must say.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of people waving their hands at me. Mary Alice, you get your hand up now.
I just have a procedural question. Since we're in the committee of the whole, can we ratify something in the committee of the whole meeting, or does that require a city council meeting?
That'll require your city council. Everything that you're discussing tonight that you're going to vote on will go to the city council tomorrow for its final action, or next week for its final action. What you're doing is just agreeing to the change in the title so that it can be placed on the agenda next week with the correct wording.
So you'll pass it out.
So this is just to move it on to city council.
Just to move it on to
Okay.
council, yes.
Thanks.
Let's move it on.
Can I have a motion?
Move it on.
Okay, Julie, do we have a motion?
Yes, I support, but I don't have the whole title here because I didn't write it down fast enough when they were discussing the.
You want me to read it to you again, Julie?
Okay, go for it.
An ordinance ratifying extending emergency order 2003, parentheses, emergency order phase 4 operating guidelines, temporarily suspending the issuance of special events permits.
Yes, I to.
That one.
You move to send it to the city council?
I sure do.
Do you have a second?
For approval?
With a recommendation for approval.
I'd like to second.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay,
Dennis seconds it. Can you please call the roll?
yes. Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Ms. Lout,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Colebrook,
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes. That's going to be passed on to the full city council. The next on the agenda is ordinance number 2020-09-045. Ratification of emergency order number 20-10, temporary ban of on-premises consumption of food and beverage within specific bounded area.
This will have a title change too, but what this is a temporary, as it says, a temporary ban on indoor consumption of food and beverages in an area that is basically our campus area restaurants. We don't have any bars that are open in that area at this point, but it's an area bounded by Springfield, Lincoln, Race, and Wright Street. And we were, this followed the unexpected and unacceptably high number of cases of COVID-19 among students on campus, and we were asked by the university, the public health district, to enact this ban, and it is in place until November 16th at 5 p.m., which coincides with the Chancellor Jones stay-at-home order, effectively, for the U of I students. And again, this is, pardon?
It's September, not November, right?
Didn't I say November?
Yeah, but the stay-at-home order is only for 2 weeks.
I meant September, sorry. I had November from the other one. It is September 16th. And it should say, I want to verify, it should say that in the
It does. It's like
duration. Yes, sorry.
2 days after we
I
ratify.
misspoke. It's September 16th, which coincides with the Chancellor's stay-at-home order. And there is one correction in the order on page 1 under definitions, 1B, the bounded area should read on the east by Lincoln Avenue, not west.
And we were also going to add a word, I believe, in section D, enforcement officer shall mean any member. So it's consistent with the other definition as well, the word mean, M-E-A-N.
Okay. Thank you. This is what happens when you have 1 hour to do this on a Friday afternoon.
They were minor typos, ma'am. Mary Alice?
I'd like to make a motion to move ordinance number 2020-09045 with recommendation for approval to City Council with all the changes that have been suggested.
Second.
Second. Sharice is the second. Clerk, can you please call the roll? Or is there any other discussion? No other discussion. Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Ms. Lout,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Colebrook,
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
That motion passes. It'll be sent on to the full City Council. The next on the discussion is item number 8, the discussion of the Hilliard Heinz presentation. Julie?
I just would like to say that I agree with what was said right at the very end of the presentation, being that this is a start for us to talk about very important issues that need to be changed in our use of force policy. And I'll defer the rest of discussion time tonight in order to hear public input for the next hour if other people are supportive of that.
Jared?
I would just request that we get a comment from the mayor on the use of force policy. I know we've been talking about the police reviewing policies, and obviously this is the policy that was most closely scrutinized and looked at by them. Or if Chief Serafin, I believe he's here. Last time I looked at participants.
He is.
Okay. Chief, if you're listening and could chime in, I'm interested in what our next steps are going to be as far as the consideration of their findings. You know, we've been talking about this a little bit, you know, the public transparency aspect of reviewing the current policy, looking at the old version versus what may be the new one, and, you know, having that come before council for discussion and so on and so forth. So I was just curious where we're at on all that.
So with regards to the use of force policy, we initially, as everyone knows, analyzed it as how it stood at the time. Since that time, Lexipol actually has given us, and that's the third-party policy entity that we use, they've actually given us they've pushed out some updates as well. And so what we have done with this is we've also then looked at it from, we wanted to see this report to see what exactly did Hilliard Heinz say, and then how can we incorporate the existing model with the Lexipol suggestions with the Hilliard Heinz suggestions. And so that's sort of where now we got all of this. I saw this and read this document on Friday. So we obviously have a little time to sort of to digest this and to then sort of try to put together at least some drafts and then figure out the best way to get some feedback on that. So sort of like you, seeing this document is new, and hopefully that we can use it to build something better.
From my perspective, I think the suggestions and recommendations were excellent, and we should make every effort to incorporate them into our policy.
Any other discussion? Dennis?
So, of course, I'm interested in, I guess, how the process will be to make specific changes to specific policies. Are we going to depend upon the police department and staff to begin editing their own policy. We don't really have complete access to all the policies that the police department are using currently, so we're not really, I guess the city council members are not going to be really actually going to engage as editors to that policy, except for how else will we really be able to rewrite policy that would be effective and follow perhaps the direction of council?
Who's that question for?
Well, either yourself, Mayor, or the chief, because I'd like to make some recommendations, but I don't know to what level or to what specificity that you want to hear recommendations, and of course the community is going to have recommendations.
So I think that the trick part of this will be try to get all those recommendations in, sort through those different bits of feedback, and then figure out how we can actually make something that we can all use. I would suspect that there'll be I think there'll be some themes that will come out, and how we can sort of inject those in. I don't know, Dennis, exactly as to how exactly we're going to what the best way is to do this. I know that one of the, I think it might have been Mr. Brown actually had forwarded me to New York City Police Department had a model or a draft policy up and had posted it up for some feedback. So I think there's some different ways that we can do that. If we had time for coffee with the cops, would be another way we could get some things. And unfortunately now the pandemic has limited some of those things. So I kind of like the idea that New York City had. So I think, I don't know if there's an exact recipe that we've used in the past for this, Dennis. So I'm hoping that by looking at a couple other models, we can get some different feedback in. So we'll take it, and we'll have to try to put it into the mix.
We'll come up with a process. And long-term, the advisory committee, the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Public Safety, one of the subgroups I think should be the Standing Committee on Use of Force. And one of the other groups, of course, was going to be looking at everything the department does in terms of its calls for service, and then reallocation of resources and that sort of thing. But we just all have seen this report for the first time on Friday, so we do need to come up with a process for getting more feedback from the public and the council and incorporating some of these fundamental changes into our own policies.
Bill Brown.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we did go through a similar process when you developed the taser policy, taser use policy. It went through the police department and went actually to CPRB, and just to receive feedback and comment from both CPRB members, council members, and any members of the public. So it was a draft document for a while, and it did take quite a while. That was a larger policy, a newer policy. Hopefully the changes in this will be more direct to add de-escalation, and maybe something about how verbal engagement is supposed to work or something like that. It seemed like a couple of the policy recommendations weren't directly use of force policy. They were more like tactical things about one person, when somebody might have a gun, one person making the verbal commands instead of having verbal commands from different people. And then the rifle, how to handle the patrol rifle, and whether or not you should engage. And part of that is if there's other people with patrol rifles there and things like that. So that, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be part of use of force, but I think all the recommendations we should work to address, and I'll to reserve my comments and discussions so we can allow time for public input.
Would anybody else like to discuss the Hillard Heights presentation tonight? Jared.
I just want to suggest that even if we're not going to have further discussion this evening in lieu of public comment, that it would still be useful for us to add this as a discussion item on another agenda. So just this shouldn't be the end of it because we haven't really talked about it at all, just for the record.
This is the beginning.
Mary Alice?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar to what Jared said, but to that end, I think it would be good for two things to happen. The first one is to have it dedicated on an agenda item in 1 or 2 weeks. I don't know what the proposed schedule is for the next 2 weeks. But the second one is, Diane, it would be good to have an idea of the process on all of these different recommendations. I realize that you might have to chunk it amongst, you have community engagement, you have, policies, you have tactics, and et cetera. But it would be good to know what we're going to start with, what the plan is and what's proposed in terms of how we're going to start to tackle all of these recommendations. At least having a skeleton of what that's going to look like up for discussion next week.
We'll share, we are in the final, we're doing the final round of interviews with the community engagement coordinator candidates tomorrow and Thursday. So we're about to advertise the position of the new Human Rights and Equity Officer position as well. So, bringing the staff on to assist with this is going to make a difference as well. But point taken, understood.
I guess just to dovetail on what Jared has said and what Mary Alice has said is, I know, Jared, you were the one who I believe, spearheaded, the idea to have some sort of a police-related issue on every council meeting, and that has been supported by, the majority of the council, if not all the council. And Mary Alice, to your point too, is, and others have made it as well, is the Hillard Hines report has, if nothing else, provided a lot of subject matter for us to talk about, and every week going forward until we completely flesh it out. So a lot of people have said this is just the beginning. It was a very comprehensive report, but there's still lots of questions and lots of issues to address. Mm-hmm. Did somebody else have their hand up as well as Jared?
That was just me, Bill. Diane, do we have our police-related subject for next week?
I believe it's GARE.
Oh yeah, I guess we did this time. I forgot.
We also have a number of other agenda items that you'll need to be addressing that are non-police related, but other business of the city as well. But I believe GARE is next week, and it's going to take us a couple of weeks to flesh out a plan to bring back to you.
Any other discussion before we move on to public comment? Sharice?
I was just going to also say that we have the training too with the principals that's coming up, and so that may be something else that we end up discussing during the meeting, and how that would help also regarding the police issues moving forward. So I'd say we've definitely got plenty to discuss in the weeks to come moving forward.
Any other council members? Having seen none, we'll close our discussion on the Hillard Hines presentation, and we'll move on to public input. Looks like Dottie Vuru Weiss has her hand raised.
Are we allowing 3 minutes or 5 minutes? There are 39 attendees besides council.
We're seeing 8 hands raised though.
Correct. 9 now, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd say if people are going to want to speak, they should raise their hands now so we know how to get them in, right?
Yeah, there's 11 right now.
13, it just keeps climbing.
Well, we got to get to 20. That's the number we set. And Jason, you did make Dottie a panelist, just in case you weren't aware.
Yeah, she has an older version of Zoom, so I have to make her a panelist to allow her to speak.
Understood.
And I believe there's 14 people with their hand raised now, if I counted correctly.
14 raised, and then Dottie makes 15.
Yeah, so is she with us, Dottie?
Yeah, Dottie, you should be able to unmute if you click your microphone in the lower left-hand corner.
Okay, done. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, my name is Dottie Vero-Wise. I've lived here in Urbana for about 7 years. And I've been very concerned about the incident that happened on April 10th and all the many weaknesses that it showed in the system here. In general, the expectation that consultants have is that they should bring a report that supports what they think the city wants to hear. And so I think that they did that in 2 ways, that they basically cleared the officers of wrongdoing, and because they followed policies, and they recognized that the use of force policies are not adequate. And of the 18 recommendations, about half of them do address the use of force. I think it's a real severe problem with the use of force recommendations, because by not including de-escalation as one of the foundations, it really set things up that both the police officers and Ms. Lewis were acting out of a sense of fear and desperation and self-preservation as they were moving forward. And this was contributing to a lot of the problematic actions that happened. So it's not just a matter of changing the use of force policies, but more importantly, changing the culture in the police, that they need to be expecting to approach the civilians differently and not be always escalating problems that are occurring. And there were a couple of specific recommendations that I think are worth noting. One is that they expect that there will be a verbal discussion by the supervisors reviewing the use of force with the officer involved, and that can be an opportunity for thinking of what could have been done differently the next time, including presumably escalation and actions like that. And then also the importance of training, so people, as Cherise suggested, well, what kinds of phrases are more useful and productive as a situation evolves. So I think that this is really promising in this sense, but I'm really concerned that, as happened with the county consultants very often, that there were great recommendations made, but they often weren't followed. So I think it's going to be really important for council members to be involved actively in continuing to push for these things. One of the things that Chief Serafin commented on was that they use Lexapol as a source of model policies. And there was just a report on NPR today on the Here and Now section on Lexapol as providing suggestions and wording that makes it less likely for police to be held accountable by saying things not that officers shall follow this procedure, but they should. And also that that in using deadly force, there should be not a requirement for an immediate threat to life and safety, but for an imminent threat, which again allows for more wiggle room in that. And so I really hope that those things will be taken into account rather than accepting the model policies that they provide as written. And finally, I was glad to hear the description of the amount of editing that the city was allowed to do, that it wasn't a way for disagreeing with the conclusions and recommendations, but rather just for clarification of details, as were mentioned. So I want to say again what I said at the beginning, which is that I was very upset at the episodes and the many different tapes that I saw at the beginning of the incident with Miss Lewis, and appalled by it, and really think that it deserves the continued deep review and changes that have been discussed tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dottie. Next up is Laura Orr.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi. So my name is Laura Orr. Some of you have heard me speak and know me from other community organizations. And so I tonight wanted to first start by thanking Bill Brown and Jared Miller for standing up for public input and its importance in this conversation, and not trying to push it back and suppress those of us that are homeschooling, working from home, doing everything from home, and really trying to like still advocate for our community, and finding it equally challenging, you know, at all hours of the evening to share our thoughts and comments. So appreciate you two standing up for our voices. So I'll get to it. Council and Mayor, I urge you tonight to see the blatant parallels between the lack of accountability and oversight on the use of force policy in the Urbana Police Department, and how this spills into the lives of so many with such dangerous implications in our schools. Now you're holding on to an idea that earlier thoughts and decisions were, quote, right in regards to the Leah Lewis case. And this morning on the local news, I heard a quote from Diane Marlin that she did not want to dwell on it any longer. Can you imagine if Aaliyah and her family had the luxury to no longer dwell on the disturbing way she was treated? To both council members and to the mayor, you not only have the luxury, you have the duty to make this right for Miss Lewis after this review. Surely, no doubt, this council is able to heed the reports, data, and input from more than one questionable independent review. You have the power here, and you can put a stop to this form of systemic racism. I ask you to do the same with the intergovernmental agreement that you entered into last fall with USD 116 to place armed police officers in our schools. This agreement needs to be canceled not only because of its moral shortfalls, but also because of its budgetary shortfalls. The Urbana School District faces a budget shortfall of $1.5 million in the 2020-2021 school year, and they cannot afford to spend $327,000 to pay the city for armed police officers to police an empty school. Last week on September 1st, Ann Hall, the president of the Urbana School Board, made a statement in support of canceling the SRO contract with the city. However, most of the school board members are afraid of being sued by the city. We ask the city council to send a clear signal that you won't be an obstacle in removing the SROs from Urbana schools. The funding of SROs has been a disservice to the people of Urbana, and while the city council is in no way solely responsible, this council has more information to work with now than the school board had when putting this briefly worded agreement together in 2019. I highly encourage this council to take this opportunity to put this additional knowledge to work by advocating for the cancellation of this agreement. This intergovernmental agreement was rushed from the beginning despite various misstatements to the contrary. And now more than ever, the agreement continues to be a misuse of needed resources that could be better supporting students in our community. Like the depth and breadth of calls to do better for Aaliyah Lewis, I hear those same calls for the removal of our SROs from the schools. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Laura. Next up is Alan Axelrod.
Right in the middle of my oatmeal. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I want to touch on two different things with the time that I have available tonight. The first one is going to be about the conversation that we had tonight and two elements that are noticeably missing. The first element is that we have to talk about Chief Serafin. on the day that you all, as the city council, reappointed Chief Seraphin, you talked about that being a conditional reappointment since he is an at-will employee and his appointment can be reviewed at any time. And part of the police chief's duty is to craft policies for his officers. The Hillard Hine presentation provided recommendations and shortfalls. Why don't we have a proactive crafting of policy by the person who is in charge of our police force? Why was it so obviously behind? Who further said on April 27th that de-escalation was inappropriate because a gun was present. The Hillard Hines presentation talked about a lot, but I failed to see any specific mention about de-escalation being appropriate in the condition that someone had a gun. Because in the event that it doesn't, we allow this exact same thing to happen again. So that is a review of two things. To include in the discussion Chief Seraphin's continuation as police chief or not, and how this should be reflected in his review process. And the second one is specifically making sure that this review process that thousands of dollars has been spent on actually addresses one of the core specific issues, which is de-escalation even when the police believe there to be a gun to be present. Now I'm going to segue to something that's more amicable to the city council. It is a much broader issue than the scope of this council meeting tonight. Ameren, Illinois is still trying to shut off people's power. The No Ameren Shutoffs campaign, which is what I've been leading since July, now composes over 26 organizations. I do not have the time to list them all and get to my point. But the main thing that I want to talk about is, what do you all think of when you hear September 11th? Because it's about to have an additional aspect. Ameren, Illinois has sent shutoff notices dated September 11th, which is going to cause a bunch of problems, not just because it is throwing insult to injury for people who are suffering. It opens you all up to federal lawsuits, just like the Decatur public school system was open to a federal lawsuit when their school system denied part of their population access to an education in late October of last year. It also will hurt you when it comes to the census. There are over 2 weeks left in the census, and people, among other things, can fill out the census online. How can you do that without power? On top of that, Illinois American Water has sent an email where they said they wanted to disconnect water. The services listed that have said how many people are going to be disconnected are NICOR and the city of Springfield. NICOR said 152,000 customers are more than 60 days overdue with their balance. Springfield alone has over 11,000 households at risk of shutoffs. The state of Illinois is the fourth most at risk for large numbers of households. It's over 400,000 based off a graph that I've seen at risk of utility shutoffs. I appreciate and applaud the mayor for actually talking to the governor about utility shutoffs. Thank you for doing that. Tomorrow, we're going to have elected representatives and candidates alongside many of our community organizations talking to the Illinois Commerce Commission to further agitate for extending the utility shutoffs moratorium. But we need more action here. We need you all to send messages in your capacity as public officials to the governor. We need you in your public capacity to ask that he use the executive order powers that the Illinois Commerce Commission told us last Monday he has always had the power to do, to avoid utility shutoffs on September 11th. We've been talking to you about this for weeks and weeks, possibly over a month now, and you have been making motions, but unfortunately they are too slow to address the urgent issue at hand. So please contact the governor so that we don't have to worry about Champaign and Urbana having their power shut off. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next up is just identified as a number. It's area code 217 and it ends in 552. Can you identify yourself, please?
And since you're on the phone, you'll need to press *6 to unmute. There
Hello,
you go.
can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Can you identify yourself, please?
I am Nate Wall, and I find it unacceptable that the presentation on the justification in the actions of 2 police officers was put prior to personal public input. That was hurtful, and it was not expected. However, I do appreciate Jared and Mr. Brown advocating for our ability to speak tonight. I've lived in Urbana for 31 years. All of my life, except for the first 5 months of it. I have 2 15-year-old black sons who both attend Urbana High School. I am proud to have graduated from Urbana High School in 2007. Many social issues affecting black people have become very public this year. As more incidents are recorded on videos, such as murders of unarmed black men and women, and unequal treatment by the police in general. This has sparked a new awareness in many Americans that racial injustice is very real and has a 400-year-old history here in the U.S. Black citizens, including my son, both of them, have been aware of this all of their lives. And living through it produces ongoing trauma. However, as racial injustice has been in the forefront of the news lately, the trauma to black and brown students has been exacerbated. I urge the city to cancel the contract you have with USD 116, which employs 2 school resource officers. The presence of armed officers in the schools could trigger the amygdala in the brains of the black and brown students, which is responsible for fight or flight. In this state, students will not be able to access their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning. In short, they will not be able to learn effectively. It is irresponsible of you, to the council, the city council, to continue a contract that allocates $327,000 of school budget monies, which should be used to support and enhance student learning instead of further traumatizing black and brown youth. Instead, I will ask you to focus your attention on the future leaders of Urbana, of our future leaders of Urbana. Which does Urbana value more? Policing students or investing in them? Investing in students looks like a variety of things. Hiring more social workers, providing district employees with training and trauma-informed practices, hiring more black and brown educators, and other actions which give students the tools necessary to navigate through their middle and high school experiences. Of course, I understand that the previously mentioned actions I desire to see in schools are not the responsibility of City Council. However, an action you can take and should is to cancel the SRO contract you have with Urbana School District 116. The success of many students depend on it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. Next up is Christopher Hansen.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Christopher Hansen. I've lived in Urbana for 18 years. I wanted to start by commenting on something that Bill Colebrook said at the last city council meeting. Marlin's new executive orders regarding gatherings during the pandemic were being discussed, and it was made rather clear by members of the public that these orders were an overreach and were going to disproportionately affect poor people. The new laws presume guilt upon any group greater than 4 people, and then requires those people to show their residency papers or prove their family relationships to police officers. We are in an era where the last thing we need right now is more friction between police officers and civilians, and you just passed laws that would create exactly these types of altercations that we should be trying to avoid. And it is exactly this type of law that has the ability to be maximally destructive to people who live in more affordable, higher density living situations and to people who have instability in their housing. Some of these people have no ability to prove their residency to a police officer. Now, Jared Miller was the only person, it seemed, who saw the problem here. And what upset me was that Bill Colebrook's outlook on passing a shitty law like this was that residents who are adversely affected can simply escalate things to an appeals court and have the law struck down by the judiciary system. Now, it is hard for me to imagine how ignorant and bullheaded and out of touch someone has to be to so casually suggest that a poor person can improve their situation by paying tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to combat their government through the court system. Surprise, surprise, this cantankerous attitude is being espoused by Bill Colebrook, a police officer. What we're seeing here is exactly the attitude that police officers have toward their victims, and that attitude is that they can destroy people's lives and excuse themselves from responsibility. And Bill, I know you live in $1 million house on a golf course and you're really into your strict rules and laws and your homeowners association because you can price yourself above all that, but your posture toward the general public is an abomination of democracy, and I think it makes you unfit to be a representative. So I think you should withdraw your statement and apologize for that. But I know you won't because you're a police officer and you're obstinate, and that's the way you and your peers see all of the people around you. And this is exactly the same attitude we've seen in regards to the Alea Lewis arrest. Every perspective, every angle, every sentence presented by these police officers from Hilliard Heinz is presented from the perspective that police officers should be able to screw up and cause problems, and innocent civilians should be made to pay for those mistakes. All we've learned here is that Mayor Marlin is so shallow that her notion of leadership in a difficult situation is that blowing $20,000 on a public relations circus is better than shouldering responsibility when the opportunity calls for it and affecting meaningful change. I believe this Hilliard Heinz fiasco has had negative value for the city of Urbana. All that has been done is to waste time and money that we could have spent getting actual work done. Now, none of this is terribly surprising to anyone. What is surprising to me, and where I am personally greatly disappointed, is that most of the city council members have decided to take such an idle posture and allow this mess to continue. And that is the ultimate failure. And I think each of you should carefully reflect on that and consider if your actions are the actions of leaders or the actions of followers. I'll just mention something about this Gare situation. That isn't being discussed tonight, but I suppose is being discussed next week. This really just sounds like another poster opportunity for me. You guys are going to sign up for another membership in something that just lets you put up a flowery poster in the halls of the city building. And you already passed the 10 shared principles and immediately started violating the tenets of transparency right after passing it. Urbana is regularly violating public records laws. So here we are months later, and I'm still waiting to see some honest conversations come out of the city council. I guess it's good that I haven't been holding my breath because it seems like we're just not going to get that. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. Next up is Tracy Chong.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm Tracy Chong, resident of Urbana. The Hilliard Heinz review of the UPD review is essentially a reactionary PR move by Mayor Marlin, with no meaningful review that cost Urbana taxpayers $20,000. Both the Urbana Police Review and the Hilliard Heinz Review missed or purposely failed to address one of the most unsafe aspects of the arrest, where Officer Ruff's rifle was unsecured with the safety mechanism off during the whole struggle. Officer Ruff's weapon was ready to fire at just a trigger pull, which God forbid did not happen during the tussle. Deborah Kirby's response to Jared's question was just an embarrassment and so very, very dishonest. The Hillard Hines report stated that the current policy is silent on the use of rifles during hands-on contact. But when asked if the team noticed that the weapon was ready to fire, Kirby said that they have to go back and see if it's against the policy. Wow, that was unbelievable to hear. This firm missed one of the biggest questionable aspects of the arrest, and their leader's response was as meaningless as it gets. Both the Urbana Police Review and the Hillard Hines Review failed to address Officer Cervantes' initial actions that triggered the whole violent chain of events. Cervantes wrote in his report after the incident that he suspected that Lewis may be armed and dangerous. But still, Officer Cervantes put away his weapon, left the cover of his car, and then ran towards Lewis and then grabbed her hand, which led to the violent tussle. Maybe Cervantes thinks he's impermeable to bullets, but it blows my mind that an officer would put himself, his colleagues, and Lewis in such a position that now meant that each person's life was threatened and each person is fighting for self-preservation. What's more likely is that Officer Cervantes knew that Lewis was unarmed based on the 911 call where it was reported that it was the guy who had the gun. He thought he could silence Lewis because he felt disrespected, so he tried to arrest her. Instead, she tried to assert her rights, and that's when shit went downhill. To cover himself and the other officers, Cervantes and Ruff lied in their police reports that they suspected Lewis had a gun, and thus it was according to policy to defend themselves from the active assailant. I guess we will never formally know because the city spent $20,000 of taxpayers' money for a superficial review of a review that Mark Giuffre admitted that they did not look into this detail, this important detail. Yet somehow they managed to say that Urbana Police Department's investigation was all good when UPD failed to investigate this key issue. Hearing Deborah Kirby avoid giving direct or meaningful answers to the questions posed by City Council members and just referring back to policy and touting the improvements they suggested is terrible. By the way, these recommendations have been identified by residents and brought forward to City Council members, to Chief Serafin, at no cost to the city. Mary Alice, you praised Kirby's thoroughness at producing the 911 call transcript. That transcript was played during Serafin's presentation, published by media months ago, and read out word for word multiple times by residents during council meetings. And the transcript that Hillard Hines produced is not even accurate. Yikes, what an embarrassment. Mayor Marilyn, you just got scammed and wasted $20,000 that could have been used for social issues that residents have been asking for week after week. I think it's quite troubling that the officers were absolved of any misconduct just because their actions were measured against a flawed and outdated use of force policy. Just because it's not stated explicitly in the policy that de-escalation should be a priority, that does not mean that it's okay to go and punch a civilian's head and knee them in the ribs. The public can see that this is wrong. I hope that you can see that this is wrong and how ridiculous it is that we are using $20,000 of taxpayer money to say that this is not wrong because de-escalation is not written in the policy. In the last CPRB special presentation, Dr. Michael Schlosser from the University of Illinois Police Training Institute gave a de-escalation presentation where he assured CPRB members and the public that UPD officers are trained and follow de-escalation techniques. Yet we still have Urbana police officers acting in direct contrast to what they are supposedly taught. Mr. Schlosser gave examples of language he teaches his trainees not to use. Yet we hear Urbana police officers using sexist, patronizing, and unprofessional language caught on video. However, there seems to be no hope of any form of accountability, even as the U of I Police Training Institute, represented by Dr. Schlosser, denies that his officers act that way. So what are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next up is Felipe Manatau.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. It's Felipe Manatau. Good evening, members of the City Council. First, I actually want to thank Jared and Dennis for expressing their objections about putting public comment at the end of the meeting. It seems troubling that you really are actually pushing people to late hours of the night when you could actually have done this earlier. So again, my name is Felipe Menanto, and I'm a proud resident, or actually used to be a proud resident of Urbana. So all through this summer, we have seen these meetings packed with public comment demanding action on racial justice in Urbana. I mean, we all have better things to do, but we think that, or we hope that we'll be doing different things, but this is actually what we feel compelled to do. Our community, I'm also myself, I'm appalled by the police assault on Alea Lewis, and has made loud calls for the implementation of a real police review board, as well as the removal of the armed police from the Urbana schools. It should be clear by now that the people of Urbana want real action and change. This is probably the biggest rights movement of our generation, at least of my generation. It should also be clear that although we're tired, that we're sad, and we're frustrated by the state of our nation, we're not going away, even if you push public comment to the end of the meeting. What we're trying to do, civilly, is to use our collective voice to convince you to do what's right. I'm here again to express my concern with the presence of armed police in the Urbana schools. Many of us have cited many times the body of research showing that increased police presence does not result in safer school, but instead is correlated with increased juvenile incarceration. I'm here to tell you that last week, there was an incredible community push at the Urbana School Board meeting to eliminate the funding for armed police from the 2020-2021 school year budget. It was really moving to hear from so many community members, from middle and high school students, recent graduates, and parents demanding that armed police should be removed from schools and that the funds should be reallocated to restorative support and resources. The Urbana School District faces a budget shortfall of $1.5 million next year, and they cannot afford to spend $327,000 to pay the city for armed officers to police empty school buildings in Urbana. Well, the president of the Urbana School Board, Ann Hall, and board member Peggy Patton want to cancel the contract with the city. Most of the school board members are afraid of being sued by the city. I would like to ask the city council to send a clear signal that they won't be an obstacle in removing armed police from Urbana schools. Last year, when the contract was first proposed, the city council showed great leadership, and I'm grateful for that enabled the healthy discussion that the school board censored at that time, and this eventually resulted in some safeguards for the students, as well as a review protocol for the contract with the police. So I would humbly like to ask you again to provide the leadership that is sorely needed here. Listen to the calls from your community, and please do what's right. City Council can step up and help rectify this error in governance that opposes the values of our community. Please cancel the contract and allow the removal of armed police from Urbana schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Elizabeth Simpson.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you for your time. My name is Elizabeth Simpson. I've lived in Urbana since 2001. I've been a professional facilitator and consultant for governmental and non-governmental groups since 1999, including doing community-wide sessions after the murder of Kewan Carrington, prior to the hiring of Chief Cobb, and other community initiatives. I have a master's in communication. I've been doing PhD research on effective small group practices with an emphasis on anti-oppression topics for the last 5 years. And I say that because I'm about to give you an evaluation of my experience of the listening session with the community that Hilliard Hines did. And I want you to know that I have the credentials to make this assessment. The session was initiated in relation to police misconduct and use of force, which means that these sessions could lead to the presence or absence of changes that would result in citizens getting hurt or killed or not. So if this undertaking is done to actually have some meaningful outcomes, it matters whether it's well done or not. And it also costs a lot of money. So again, in terms of efficiency, it matters whether it is well done or not. So as a professional facilitator of 20 years and as a researcher for the last 7 years, I can say with absolute confidence that the claim on the opening page of the Lewis report that the information was collected with investigative diligence is absolutely absurd. The data gathering in the listening session was so poorly designed that I cannot believe this is a national firm currently doing police review work in over 10 cities, unless the purpose is simply to do a display of fanfare with no intention to make meaningful change. I did only participate in a listening session, so I can't speak to the complete range of the work that was undertaken. However, it was so poor that I really have strong concerns about the veracity of the rest of the findings. The report says that there was a 15 to 20 minute presentation. That is not true. It was an hour presentation out of a 90-minute session, which means that the group who got together was only used for maybe 20 minutes. After that hour of presentation, we had 20 minutes in a small group. The report says we were given a questionnaire. We were not. We were emailed a questionnaire in advance. We were not told we would have to somehow have access to it at the time. That questionnaire was in a PDF form. It was unfillable. We were told that we needed to somehow collect everybody's responses, numeric responses, collate them ourselves, create the average ourselves, and then report that out to the group, which is absurd. Then after doing that, we only had 6 minutes left to answer our 7 open-ended questions. And as I'm sure you know, if you have a group of 5 people with 6 minutes answering 7 questions, you get basically no answers. But even if we had answers, there was no representative from the group to take any notes from the consulting group. And so people just kind of talked. And when we were supposed to report out, the person who reports just sort of says what's on their mind. So in terms of actually trying to make an assessment of community perspectives, it was a total failure. So just to clarify again, an hour of presentation, giving us the quantitative work. We could have got that quantitative stuff done with a survey. I could have done this report myself, this aspect of it, just far more effectively. And what this means is that if you're just getting reports out of whoever's speaking, you're going to get their perspectives instead of a sort of research-based outcome of what is actually the wisdom in the room. So in the future, if you want something more effective, you could hire me. But also, you could just listen to the community, because we have been speaking since April. And as someone recently said just now in input, we have already told you over and over again the results, research-based, et cetera. I mean, we have a huge panel of expertise in our community, and we keep giving you our labor for free. We didn't need a review to know what the community has been demanding, which is to deprioritize police funding, prioritize actual community safety through non-police responses to disputes, mental health, and neighborhood concerns. And finally, that the results and the findings that the use of force in the case of Ms. Lewis is consistent with UPD policy, and I'm quoting from the report here, that the finding was the use of force in the case of Ms. Lewis is consistent with UPD policy. This is just a fact. It's not relief. It is a confirmation that UPD policies are not in alignment with the needs of community, and they indicate a pretty much sure thing that there will be future harm in our community to our community members. And for those of us who have been watching consistently City Council now for almost 6 months, we know that it is your role. We know you have a role. We've been waiting for you to speak out about this, to take a stance about this, and it has not happened. And I personally will continue to hold you responsible for your role in leadership. At the same time, as I always close with you, I know you're doing a lot of work. I know you're trying, and especially as a white person in these times, we have to throw down harder and not just have this sort of report thing, because we've already known what to do. We've been telling you what to do for 6 months. It's not that you need more information. What we need you to do and what you need to do is to take action. And I look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, can I interject something?
Yes, you can, Mary Alice.
I'd just like to make a motion to extend the meeting to 11 p.m. to get in all the public input of the people whose hands are raised.
I'd second that.
Okay, Mary Alice with the motion, Julie with the second. Is there any discussion?
I may have to leave early because I have something I have to do.
Okay, understood. Clerk, can you call the roll?
Yeah, just a second.
We might need to limit to 3 or 4 minutes though to get it, because there's, if you do the math at 5 times 9.
Okay,
I don't know
Miss.
the rules if we've started to allow 5 minutes when, or if we can curtail to 3.
Okay. Just, sorry, I didn't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I just don't know that rule since we started with 5.
Sorry.
Miss Wu,
Yes.
Miss Lout,
Yes.
Miss Hersey,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes.
Mr. Colebrook,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mayor Marlin. Okay, she must have stepped away.
Well, with that, the motion passes. The
Yes.
extended.
Okay.
The mayor
I'm here.
says yes.
All right, thank you.
So the motion has passed. The meeting has been extended to 11 o'clock.
We have 9 left, Bill, at 5 minutes each. That would be 45 minutes. We have 40 minutes left. So I think maybe we'll just go with what we were doing. I think it'd be best. Maybe there won't be a full 5 minutes for somebody.
Somebody just got added too. So I've got next up Commander Ezra. Was that the next on the list?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is Jane McClintock. Sorry for the Zoom mistake. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Well, thanks for sticking with us and thanks for sticking up for us, Jared, because it's really important to have input, and we've put a lot of time into reading this report, which we didn't exactly ask for it, and trying to understand it and honestly, I think the community understands this arrest a lot better than our quote unquote experts who didn't know how to pronounce Kamarian or exactly what happened. I was trying to scribble down the factual explanation that did not exactly comply with my understanding of what happened in the incident and couldn't really keep up. So I agree with, much of what has been said already. I really think that there's no reason the city shouldn't act immediately on these blaring inadequacies in our use of force policy, which community has been telling you about. And now apparently, if you needed it, you have experts who have told you, quote unquote, experts, who I have some questions about, but, we really need de-escalation. We need that in the policy. We need to make it clear to our officers what our expectations are. And clearly just fixing these holes, just asking them not to use racist, sexist, and disrespectful language is not enough, but it's a place to start. So let's get that in the policy immediately. And you can see that the community is asking for much, much more. So please, let's move on this. Let's move honestly on this. Also, it's a terrifying realization about the safety on the gun. I sent you guys some pictures just for your reference. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. And yeah, I don't know. It's like you guys said, it's kind of hard to be 100% here at this time of night. So I will pass it on to Danielle Chenoweth and let her say her piece.
Hello. So hundreds of folks have spoken and demanded justice for Aaliyah and real change in policing in Urbana. I do want to comment on the report provided by Hiller Heinze. I'll call them HH. So this is the contradiction in their report. 2 things. 1, the public argued for a civil rights investigation and the city ordered a review of police procedure. There are some benefits to that, which I will get to. Second, I really want to emphasize the contradiction in their report. On the one hand, it deeply criticizes the gaps in the use of force policy, and then it absolves the police of wrongdoing as measured against this fundamentally flawed and dangerous use of force policy. So what you can do going forward is work on the use of force policy, but I want to point out a few other gaps that we'll have to look at. One is we still need accountability for the police brutality committed against Aaliyah Lewis, who is again in court today and is facing prison time and multiple felony charges. The second is we need to review the role of racial profiling, racism, and sexism, and the way it played out in this arrest. I was deeply disappointed that there was no commentary on that in the report. Third, we really have to fix the broken complaint process. I think a laughable part of the report is that they say no formal complaint alleging excessive force was received, so Internal Affairs did not investigate the incident. In fact, hundreds of written complaints were made to the city, including an eyewitness who complained directly to the mayor. Multiple formal complaints were filed. There have been dismissals. It's been in violation with UPD policy 323, internal investigations, that states it is the policy of the Urbana Police Department to investigate all claims of misconduct by employees. Third, we are missing public access to the use of force policy, which is heavily redacted or partially redacted. I mean, body camera footage and police reports, and even the HH report itself, only 3 of the 13 attachments of the report were released to the council or the public. And then I really want to address the fact that there was such the description of the incident was watching a fish get bigger and bigger as current and former law enforcement weigh in and warp the truth. This whole idea that somehow Lewis has assaulted and struck Cervantes, which started as actually her reeling back and turned into her throwing an uppercut, it's like it just keeps growing. The reps say a gun can be concealed in a shoe, crotch, or back pocket, but they failed to notice she was wearing flip-flops and pajama pants. The report says Cervantes gave verbal commands, and yet he gave no commands prior to putting his hands on her, unless you consider you not fixing to go home, you fixing to go to jail as a clear directive, which is the language that they criticize in the report. They say that Ruff struck Lewis, but they remove in the head. This is clearly spin. I could go on. Now, let me just point out what you can do. You can make legislation by making a motion to fix the use of force policy that is shown to be outdated, inadequate, and dangerous. The escalation is entirely absent. There's no guidelines or limits on use of force for individuals in restraint, which is terrifying to find out. Their policy is silent about the danger of positional asphyxiation. It's silent about use of rifles during hands-on contact with residents. There's inadequate training and process for use of force investigations. And then, of course, we have the issue of the language. And it's really important to note that the report itself says that civilians who are the subject of an officer's use of force are potentially the best witnesses because of their physical proximity to the force used, which is a very strange Orwellian kind of statement. But the issue is they themselves did not follow this in their own investigation. They commit the same offense that they're arguing against. They say that you should go through the attorney, and they never reached out to her attorney to get any side. So it's very one-sided investigation. But I do think the key nugget, the kind of gold in this, is that they've really laid out a pathway for you to make use of force changes, and you should demand this of your chief. And you should move forward with those pieces as one piece of the larger puzzle. And thank you so much for staying so late, listening to us. And even after our children are going to bed, have gone to bed, we can get input to you on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Danielle. So next up is Justin Michael.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Justin Michael Hendricks. I'm a Champaign-Urbana resident, Parkland College student. I'll start off and begin with Diane. How was the anti-Black Lives Matter protests covered up by Back the Blue? Was it for pleasure or political gain? I think we all should know. I'm very upset that a percentage of my tax dollars went to supporting cops who think it's cool to victimize Black and brown women. Did we really need $20,000 to review to witness violence and assault on individuals by cops? No, we did not, and that's very dirty of you, Diane, and you should know it. I feel like you all should know that personally. I feel like you know them personally too. That's why they investigated the case. Are you supporting these actions by the cops? I seriously would like to know a yes or no answer for the people who voted on you for that chair. It's up soon, by the way. I hear more about the cop's thumb than Aaliyah's injuries. Let's stop if we want to be fully transparent. We're not worried about a thumb. We're worried about her livelihood here. What you have done was continue the silencing of Black women and girls. What you have done is erase the practices of little protection that Black women and girls have at all. To know that the head punches and knees to the backs are allowed on a young lady that was nowhere near the men's weight, nor near their weight class, even if she had quadrupled their weight. Can we please have the weight on these individuals compared to Aaliyah? I don't know anybody willing to let someone 4 times their size to be forcible with body weight on them. I wouldn't even let them lay on me that far for that long. Did she have to grab his gun or reach for the gun because it was clear she never had a gun at all? So why, with all his years of experience, would he feel threatened or in fear to believe that he would have to resort to gunplay when she's trying to get away from 3 huge men? He could have killed her. She could have been killed, especially at the rate of how Black lives are being killed by blue lives that you all back. Don't be dirty, do better. Drop the charges and charge the cops. Release their priors as well, because we want to know what the history is. Or stand up to them and say something, Diane. Say something that you support them so that we know where you really stand when it comes to physical attacks against Aaliyah Lewis and other Black women and girls when encountering the law enforcement. And that's for all city council as well as we're talking. Included, as we're all playing a lot to this game, and my tax dollars are included. Give me my money back, because I think it's foolery that y'all had to sit here and pay for that foolish investigation and pulled it off with a stunt. And then you have to include it in the News Gazette as well? Why? We understand that you're limited, but be aware that we're watching and we're mindful at all. Jared, thank you for everything that you're doing. You're speaking out for it. This is why we say defund the police and reframe the justice system, because you failed us all, but yet to protect us, as Tracy and Danielle has exposed your case of misconduct and abuse that you're denying. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Next up is Bo David Barber.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So my name is Bo Barber. I'm from Ogden, Illinois. So I just kind of wanted to speak on one thing before I had to kind of comment about the Hilliard Hines investigation. I wanted to reiterate Alan Axelrod's point about the Ameren shutoffs and the American Water shutoffs. It's on September 11th. That has 2 meanings for me. That's my birthday, and then that's also the day of the September 11th terrorist attacks. I don't like celebrating my birthday anymore. I hate it. But it's not about me. It's about, the 3,000 people that died that day, and the fact that, we need to do something. We need to do something to make sure that we are not going to lead to another surge of massive death. There's already over 160,000 people that have died across the nation because of this. And if water shutoffs and utility shutoffs occur, in the best case scenario, people's lives will be ruined, people's access to education will be cut off, people's ability to work remotely will be just destroyed. And that's the best case. In the worst case scenario, in the likely scenario, people die. People will die. That's no embellishment. That's no just making this, exaggerating. People will die if their power utilities are shut off and their water is shut off during a pandemic. So I urge you to take some kind of action, because if this is what happens on September 11th, we're going to remember it for 2 reasons. And that's, people say never forget 9/11 and the thousands of people and the firefighters that died, that sacrificed their lives to save people. And it would just be an injustice and a disgrace to all the people that died on that day to not have tried to do something to stop other lives from being lost. That being said, I hope I have enough time to get to the rest of my comment here, but about the Hilliard Hines investigation. So, as said by many people before, I'm probably going to sound a little bit redundant here, but I mean, dang, you have to go after Tracy Chong. I mean, God, I don't know how some of y'all still have jobs after Tracy Chong just pulls all the receipts here. But Brian Serafin said on record on August 27th that de-escalation was not used because it was not appropriate due to the presence of a gun. I would ask the council and anyone on this call to think about this, because why would you try and solve a situation where you believe something could become violent by escalating it into the violence and making it worse, and not trying to de-escalate to prevent the violence? That confounds me. the Heinz investigation only proved that UPD followed the policies of the letter. It does not mean the policy is right. It does not mean the policy is racist. It does not prove, or it does not disprove that it disproportionately brutalized and traumatizes people of color and minorities, and it did not prove that this actually helps to prevent violence. Instead, in the report itself, from the community survey portion, as well as the weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of our public comment, week in, week out, every single night, that the public does not trust the police. In the community survey portion, it said they want more transparency, they want less funds to go to the police, they don't want the police department. They believe that the police department does not have the protection and welfare of the Black community in their best interest in that report. And this is sadly just another demonstration of the lack of good faith by the municipal government of Urbana, especially you, Mayor Marlin. What were some other ones that you may ask? I'm glad you hypothetically asked me, Diane. Well, currently, one of your council members is just a replacement cop on the council who would rather rubber stamp whatever you hand down to him without considering the impact on the community, because he was only appointed to this position by you at the request of the previous cop. That makes sense, though, that you would do that, seeing that you were backed by police unions during your campaign for office, which you proudly touted until recent months. Let's not forget your most recent display of bad faith acting when you attended the Back the Blue rally the other week, where several people on camera from WCIA showed people were not wearing masks, not socially distancing, yet you come to every city council meeting proclaiming COVID-19 to be a serious community health issue. Don't get me wrong, it is a serious health issue. So what the heck were you doing there? Back the Blue and Blue Lives Matter is a racist group that was made in direct opposition to Black Lives Matter. So what are you saying? You want to make a statement on that at some point later? Do what you got to do, but it's clear cut and dry racism. I will give you props for the one sliver of truth you imparted to us once. You said that Bryant Serafin was one of the good ones, that he follows this department's policies very closely. You're correct. He does follow the department policies very closely. It's just too bad that this policy is both violent and racist, and Bryant Serafin is more than delighted to enforce such a policy. Glad you spent almost $20,000 of your constituents' tax dollars to figure that out. You fund the police, fund the community and its people, drop the charges against Lee Lewis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Next up is Megan Miracle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So I want to start out and say I'm just kind of baffled by the response tonight and the devaluing of time by moving public input until the last minute. I hope you account for this in the future by creating additional time for public comment and holding your promise to the community. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to be reiterating what other people have said and spoken very well on tonight, but I think it's worth saying again. So to start, the members of the community who have been consistently calling into city council meetings did not ask for this review and raised significant concerns about Hillard Hines, their credentials, and their association with police officers. The review raises substantial concerns about the UPD use of force policy and then attempts to absolve the officers involved in the assault of Leah Lewis using that same use of force policy that has been found wanting. All of this obscures the fact that what happened on April 10th should never have happened. It is a direct result of the actions that the police officers involved took on that day to escalate and inflict harm. The very fact that we cannot find them at fault, while also stating that existing policies fail to protect the community from the violent institution of policing, shows us the problems that are at the heart of our criminal justice system and society as a whole. We cannot excuse the violence and racism and sexism of the Urbana police just because they exist within a system in which violence, racism, and sexism are not explicitly condemned. We need to change the system and hold these officers accountable simultaneously. Beyond that, I want to emphasize one major point about this review. So as others have said, Hillard Hines claims to have conducted learning sessions that represent a broad swath of Urbana community members, but out of only 50 residents who were invited, which I have lots of questions about why only 50 residents were invited in the first place, only 18 responded, which equates to 0.04 of the population of Urbana, much less than the number of people who have already called and emailed to share their feedback directly. Mayor Marlin has repeatedly emphasized that Hillard Hines was selected because of their ability to elicit feedback from the public, but this report has failed to even come close to this goal. As a qualitative researcher myself, I can tell you that the questionnaire provided in the appendix of the review is poorly designed and contains obfuscated questions such as, what do you think would help the community feel officers are being held accountable when force is used? Which implicitly suggests that the problem with officer accountability is a problem of perception, not a problem of lack of true justice. The questions lead those taking the questionnaire to come up with abstracted reasons why use of force is necessary, rather than digging into the harm and problems that use of force causes. And the questionnaire and vague recruitment materials fail to mention racism or discrimination at all. And the report, in fact, fails to do this as well, avoiding a systemic conversation in order to restrict respondents' answers to in-person encounters with UPD, asking them to report instances of force along a confusing scale that goes from appropriate to zealous to too much to excessive. It became clear through tonight's presentation that the range of the review was highly restricted, as it couldn't even extend to firearm use fully. There's also the continued problem with how the word reasonable is being weaponized to cover all police actions, but erase the trauma experienced by the victims of police brutality. I think there are two main conclusions the City Council should draw from this report. One, it is clear based on the feedback that was received and the feedback that you have been receiving for months that there is a lot of work to be done. To be clear, this review is not the work. I implore you not to treat this review as your indication that you've done something. This review will not get the charges against Aaliyah Lewis dropped. You've been clear about that. It does not address the racism at the heart of policing. Secondly, I recommend that you look closely at the assumptions at the heart of this review and the way that it's framed first and foremost as a defense of police and policing, not a legitimate reflection of the experiences and input of the community. But you could always look back through the hundreds of emails and hours of public comment for that. Defund the police, abolish the police, actually do something for Aaliyah Lewis and the 27 protesters arrested on May 31st. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Megan. Next up is Brian Dunn.
Good evening. My name is Brian Dunn. I live in Champaign. I just wanted to comment on the report on the Aaliyah Lewis case, basically solidifying my opinion that police, as they currently stand, are never going to be able to, do their job in a way that does not oppress members of the community. I think it's unfair to police, as it is unfair to our community members. If you truly believe Blue Lives Matter, we need to take it upon ourselves to reshape policing, to abolish it as it currently stands, and to revision public safety in a way that doesn't put people in these positions as a default, where you have a man, three men on top of a woman, and one of them sees fit to punch her in the back of the head, supposedly because he believes she may have a gun underneath her or something like that. His aim is not to grab her arms or to, flip her over, search her. No, his aim is to punch her in the back of the head. That is just a person looking to hurt another person. And judging by all humans I've ever interacted with, I'm not surprised. It's a situation that no one is going to be acting responsibly in, regardless what the guidelines in some policy are. And we need to think critically and sensibly about what we are putting people through. Policing and policy has a long way to catch up to get to current public sentiment. We understand that there are better places now that we could be investing these dollars. We don't need police in school. We don't need police responding to the majority of the calls that they respond to. We don't need police pulling people over and telling them they have the wrong sticker on the back of their car. We're welcoming these situations that, result in police killing people and community members losing their lives. No one wants to be in these situations. This is an unprecedented time in our country's history. This is the time to make big moves. If anything, the report given tonight just shows that we don't have a system that we need to reform. We have a system that we need to do away with. That transformation will most likely be slow. It will most likely, not be perfect. And that's all the more reason to start now. We need to convince ourselves first that there is a better way to treat each other. And then we can go about creating that change in the community. So this is about everyone working together. Blue lives aren't actually a thing because that's just a career. But if you're truly, wanting the best for everyone in the community. That includes the police in the community. And I think that we need to be removing them from a lot of the situations that we put them in. And we also need to be building better systems to care for our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Catherine Majewski.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to keep this relatively brief because I think that much of what I would like to say has already been said and somewhat more eloquently than I could probably manage. But I would like to back Laura Orr and Nate Wall and Felipe Menento and the other people who have spoken in favor of USD 116 canceling the school resource officer contract with the city. I think a lot of my concerns have already been fairly well stated here. It's astonishing to me, frankly, that this is an issue here. We are funding. I have self-planned out. I completely lost my train of thought. I am so sorry. It's a very late night. Public comment has been pushed quite late, and I would like to state my thanks to those of you who have spoken up in favor of not postponing it because this is the result. But yes, continuing to fund school resource officers during a pandemic when students are already traumatized. I mean, there has been much said already on the effects of this on student engagement, student performance, student trauma, the intersections with various other concerns that students may face. But connecting this particularly to the Hilliard Heights investigation, I want to point out the rather staggering lack of established policy or consistent policy on de-escalation, on use of force. Why are we putting this in schools with minors? It is frankly astonishing to me. That makes absolutely no sense that this is something that we deem to be acceptable. These are reactive solutions to things that can much better be handled proactively through things like counseling and early intervention. It is, I don't have words. I had words and I am astonishingly frustrated. I don't have words. This is why I typically email, but I have very little confidence that my emails aren't just vanishing into the ether. So I felt it necessary to put public input tonight. So yes, I would like to back the call to cancel the SRO contract. And I would like to emphasize that the city should not pose barriers to the school board's attempt to do this, should that be voted through. And I will use the last little bit of time to reiterate a couple of things I've emailed about. Police also shouldn't be involved with mental health interventions. They should not be first responders on that. And I would also like to back up the call for justice and dropping the charges against Aaliyah Lewis and the protesters arrested on May 31st. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Next up is Rita Connerly.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I do apologize for any interruptions. I am currently on the road traveling. However, I am very disappointed. I'm sorry, I'll start over. My name is Rita Connerly. I reside in Champaign-Urbana. And I'll start off by saying I'm very disappointed that I just sat and listened to a 2-hour explanation of a justification. 2 hours of listening to how your allies, Hilliard and Hines, or whatever their name is, found nothing wrong about what the public has seen as police brutality. So what we've seen is incorrect, and what has been filmed is not credible. We've even heard your experts speak of the punches and the knees to the body that Aaliyah experienced, but then made excuses as far as why it was okay. Even excusing the way the white officer spoke to this black woman. A clear display of patriarchal whitewash society. Over $16,000 to hire an agency of experts that has found that Urbana's police were in compliance while noting there were some areas that could have been
Ma'am, we're losing you.
improved. However, to me, it sounds like they justified racism and sexism. It really took someone from the outside to vouch for your inabilities to properly serve in their duties as officers, the failures of their chief to discipline those officers, and Diane's feelings about
Ms. Connerly, we're losing you.
her staff, which interferes with her poor choices and trickles down from the top, excuse me. As a Black woman, a survivor of domestic violence, why are we seeking to protect police in their department, which historically we know was created to capture nigger slaves? As a Black woman, understand how discredited, misrepresented, and devalued we are. Not properly protected by our own, yet we are expected to believe that our local authorities will serve and protect us. As a Black woman, we normalize abuse. We become reliant on trauma, and because of the acceptance by society, sometimes have no outside support to get out. There is such a distrust of institutions. Oftentimes, women feel forced to stay in a bad situation. Look at the Leah Lewis case specifically. Since we want to talk and discuss hypotheticals, then hypothetically, remove all labels and titles. Had that been a Black man on top of a white woman, he would have been arrested and questioned later. In that case, it would have been, it would not have been innocent until proven guilty. For Aaliyah, there's definitely no justice, as she is still the victim twice over. Once for domestic violence, and the other, police brutality. Now being targeted by the judicial systems attempting to criminalize her. Further, had she been a white woman, we know things would have been much different and officers would have been rewarded for acting as a savior to a damsel in distress. Shame on you, Urbana, and many of the members that sit on this council. How can you sleep peacefully knowing that this young girl's life may be over simply for trying to get help? This is why I continue to support defunding the police, reinvesting in communities, because those same communities that you're trying to criminalize, you need to be investing in. The cultural influences of Black women does not equal to the protection of them. So I ask, when do we take time to sit back and ask the victim, Aaliyah Lewis, how's she doing? The same way you were concerned about an officer's thumb, what about Aaliyah's body? What support can we provide to offer helpful solutions that aid in healing? What restorative practices do you seek to implement? What other forms of rehabilitation can benefit our community and our citizens over incarcerating them? If only for a moment, imagine Aaliyah was your loved one. Although many of you wouldn't want to because you revel in your privilege, but if for a moment, imagine your skin being the reason for the overreactive ways white America treats and interacts with you. Also, cancel contracts for officers in the schools. Why do we need armed guards in our prisons? In our schools. I mean, why are we reinforcing the school to prison pipeline? Why? Especially when the data shows the disparities. It shows that Black and brown children are being issued more discipline, referrals, and arrests. So I'll end with justice for Aaliyah, RSOs out of school, and drop all the charges against what you guys are considering rioters and looters from those who were protesting as relates to the racial injustices faced every day by Black and browns. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll have time for one more. I believe that is Megan McDonald.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
All right, great. Hello, Mayor Marlin, if she's still on this call, and the rest of the City Council. My name is Megan McDonald. I'm from Ward 5. I originally wasn't going to show up today. I was going to take a break because this morning was Aaliyah's court date, and it's been a long day of just, actually supporting people in this community and not trying to police them and put them away for life for being Black, for being alive in America. Anyway, so it's been a long day, and it's 11 o'clock at night, and I hopped on just to kind of, make it worth our time. I show up every week, and I think you all are gonna keep hearing from us and keep having late meetings, and you're just gonna have to deal with that until you make significant changes to city policy, to police policy, to defunding the police, to essentially abolishing the police, and shifting those responsibilities from them and creating a new community and a new way to interact with each other where everyone gets to feel safe. So yeah, I didn't really prepare anything today because I didn't expect to be on this, but you kept it going so long and you put public input at the end, hoping that people would fall asleep or that you could get through stuff more quickly. I don't think this went any more quickly than any other meetings that we've had for the last few months. So I don't know what the point was, just making it less accessible. You chose Hillard Hines apparently because of their ability to solicit public feedback, but then you do everything in your power to be unclear about public input directions. You consistently keep us at 3 minutes instead of the allotted 5, or you did, up until about 2 weeks ago. You consistently kept us at 3 minutes instead of the allotted 5, even when there were less than 20 people. You stopped reading emails. So I would just like to point out the real reason you chose Hillard Hines, in case it wasn't obvious to anyone on the council or anyone listening, is they're retired and active police officers. That's literally who works for Hillard Hines. So the city spent almost $20,000. Mayor Marlin, literally chose to spend $20,000. I don't think the council was consulted. So spent $20,000 for cops to investigate cops. There wasn't any facilitated public input on who this firm should be, on what the steps should even be, to check if the police's use of force policy was in line or not. Like Brian Dunn said earlier, the police have a lot to catch up on as far as public thought about how we interact with each other and how we keep each other safe. And I don't think Hillard Hines was maybe even the move to go about did the cops do the right thing? No, just look at the video, ask yourself, does that look right? And if you can think, yes, that looks right. I just, exactly. Like Kit said, how can you sleep at night? Or somebody else said that. Anyway, yeah, Kit, I'm tired too. Solidarity. Anyway, how much time do I have left? I have 1 minute and 30 seconds. So I will take that time because I have had so much of my time taken away from me trying to do y'all's job. Your job is to listen to the community. Your job is to take care of this community. Your job is to make Urbana be the place that we all want it to be, that we all thought it was, that a lot of us who were white and privileged, we had experienced it as, and the curtains pulled back. So look at it and do something about it. Jared is basically the only one up there advocating for any kind of real change. Julie, I hope you do too. I know that you're sick of, or you might be sick of public comment or whatever, but this is how it's going to be. This is how it's going to keep being, because Aaliyah Lewis and the protesters from May 31st at Marketplace Mall, they're scared. Their lives are literally in danger. They're worried about how they're going to eat, how they're going to live. They can't sleep at night. A lot of them didn't do anything wrong. And even if they did, no one's life deserves to end by police brutality, by the mass incarceration system. That's not your job to decide who lives and who dies. So do your job and take care of this community. Thanks.
Thank you. So real quick, got emails today, basically subject of Hilliard Heinz, got emails from Sharon Irish, John Hayes, Julie Watkins, so I don't butcher his first name, Mr. Cisneros, Anne-Marie Esposito, and Danielle Chenoweth. Regarding SROs, got emails from Danielle McFarland, Naomi Pake, Sarah Hogue, Amina Payne. Regarding Hilliard Heinz and traffic stop data, Daryl Cruz. The agenda order, John Hayes, and then gun rifle safety, Jane McClintock. So that's the end of our agenda items. Is there any more business from the council? If not, we're going to have to extend real quick. Seeing no business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.